The wind had dropped completely by the time I realized how quiet the night had become. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt deliberate, as though the world itself had been holding its breath. I had been driving back from a friend's house on the outskirts of Pennsylvania, somewhere near the edge of the Allegheny National Forest, where the roads twist and turn through dense trees so close they almost block out the moonlight. The car's headlights cut narrow slices through the darkness, but even they seemed hesitant, unwilling to illuminate too far ahead. I remember thinking how foolish it was to be out here alone on a night that felt so empty, but I had a stubborn streak. I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road, just beyond a curve where the trees opened briefly. At first, I thought it might be someone hitchhiking, but there was something off. The figure was completely still, almost rigid, and its clothes didn't move at all in the faint breeze. I slowed the car instinctively, and the headlights briefly illuminated it. I could make out a pale face that didn't reflect light properly, eyes that were too dark and too wide, staring directly at me. For a moment, I froze, the engine idling in a deafening quiet. Then the figure raised one arm in a slow, deliberate wave. I slammed the car into reverse before I could process why I would even consider stopping. My stomach churned as I backed up, trying to put distance between us. When I looked in the rearview mirror a few seconds later, the figure was gone. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the curve in the road and the shadows of trees stretching like long fingers across the asphalt. My pulse was hammering, and I tried to convince myself it was just some local kid playing a prank, or maybe a trick of the shadows. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I kept driving, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The forest seemed to close in, the trees forming dark walls on either side. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement at the edges of the beams of my headlights, fleeting glimpses of something stepping just out of sight. It didn't make any sense. I was miles from the nearest house, miles from the nearest anything. There shouldn't have been anyone, anything. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed down on me, and I started to feel like the headlights weren't illuminating the road. They were revealing me to something waiting in the shadows. About 20 minutes later, the road curved sharply and then opened up into a long, straight stretch. I relaxed a little, May thinking I could push the accelerator and just get out of this section. But then I saw it. A small, weathered mailbox at the edge of the road, like any rural mailbox. Only it had a name on it made my stomach drop. My name. Not my full name, just the first name, scratched into the paint in what looked like deep gouges. My eyes darted around, trying to see if there was anyone else there, but the road was empty. The forest on either side was still. I checked my mirrors obsessively. Nothing. I rationalized that it must be a prank from someone I knew, maybe an ex, maybe a friend with a sick sense of humor. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. I lived several towns over. Nobody would have driven out here just to carve my name into a mailbox. I didn't stop to look closer. I pressed on, though my hands shook and my chest felt tight. The feeling of eyes on me never left, like something invisible was riding alongside the car, keeping pace. Every so often, I thought I caught movement in the rearview mirror, dark shapes sliding between the trees, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing. I tried calling my friend, but the signal was gone. The darkness felt suffocating, and every mile felt longer than the last. I began to wish I'd never left the main highway. Then, about an hour later, I saw headlights coming toward me. Relief washed over me. Finally, another car, someone to share this road with. But as they drew closer, I realized the car was moving strangely, too slowly for the speed limit on that stretch. And then it happened. I could see the driver, and it wasn't a person. The face was pale and gaunt, mouth opening and closing like it was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Its eyes were black voids, staring straight at me. I slammed on my brakes, my own headlights cutting across the asphalt in panic. When I looked again, the car was gone. No sound of tires, no taillights retreating into the distance. It had vanished. By this point, I was hyperventilating, gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I debated turning around and going back the way I came, but the road behind me looked just as dark and unwelcoming. Something inside me urged forward, so I pressed on, each mile filled with the creaking of my car, the occasional snap of a branch in the forest, the rustle of leaves that felt like footsteps just beyond the trees. I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being followed. Not a person, not a car, but something else. Something that didn't belong. The next strange occurrence happened at a bridge crossing over a shallow creek. The bridge was old, wooden, with gaps between the planks that I could see through into the water below. I slowed down as I approached, noticing a figure standing in the middle of the bridge. This one was different. It was wearing a long, dark coat, its face hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move when I got closer. My car creaked as I drove past it slowly, and I swear I could hear it whispering something, a long, drawn-out hiss that I couldn't understand. My stomach knotted. I checked my mirrors again. The figure was gone. Just the bridge, empty, nothing but the groan of wood beneath my tires. I tried to focus on the road ahead, willing myself not to imagine the shadows. But then came the scratches. It started faintly at first, a rhythmic scratching against the car, like nails dragging across metal. I slammed on the brakes. The noise stopped. I got out, peering into the darkness around the car. Nothing, not a single sound except the creek babbling below. But as I got back in and closed the door, the scratches started again, this time on the other side of the car, then above, then all around. I could hear something moving over the roof. My chest tightened, sweat running down my back. I didn't look. I floored it, and the car jolted forward, the tires squealing on the old asphalt. The noise followed me for miles, or maybe it was just in my mind. Eventually, I reached a small town, the first signs of civilization I'd seen in hours. The streets were deserted, quiet, but I felt a fleeting sense of relief. I parked near a gas station and tried to calm myself. The clerk was an older man who didn't speak much, just nodded when I asked for directions to the highway. I tried to make casual conversation, joking about being out in the woods, but he just stared at me with an unreadable expression. When I asked if anyone had reported strange occurrences on the roads that night, he shook his head. But his gaze lingered on me longer than necessary, and there was something in his eyes, warning or pity I couldn't tell, which made me uneasy. I got back on the highway, thinking I was finally leaving the forest behind. But the feeling didn't leave. The darkness pressed in, heavier than it should have been. Shadows seemed to cling to the roadside, to the trees, to the gaps between the signs. Every mile I covered, I felt like something was just behind me, riding along with the car invisible in the night. And then I saw it. The rearview mirror reflected the faint outline of a figure in the back seat. My breath caught. I slammed on the brakes and whipped my head around. Nothing. The seat was empty. I tried to convince myself it was my reflection, a trick of the dim interior light. But I knew. I had seen too much, felt too much. I knew something had been there, something that didn't belong. By the time I finally reached my town, the familiar streetlights, the houses, even the distant hum of traffic, I should have felt safe. But the sense of dread didn't dissipate. My driveway, my own home, felt alien. I pulled in, heart hammering, eyes darting to every shadow that crossed my yard. I locked the doors, double-checked every window. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I told myself it was over, that I was safe, that nothing had followed me this far. But as I sat in my living room trying to calm down, I noticed something on the front door, a small, crude carving, my name, again. Only this time it was fresh, the wood split and raw like it had been made moments ago. I called the police. They arrived quickly, checked the property, the yard, even the surrounding woods. Nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. They suggested it might be someone playing a joke, vandalism, maybe even my imagination running wild. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But I knew. I had been followed, watched, hunted, and I didn't know why or by what. The only thing I knew was that whatever it was, it had marked me. It had marked me, and it wasn't finished. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every distant sound of wind against the windows made my heart race. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving just out of sight, reflections that didn't match the room. My dreams were filled with the forest, the bridges, the figures, the pale faces in the dark. And then I woke to a sound I'll never forget, The whispering, faint but unmistakable, coming from the corner of my bedroom. My name, repeated over and over. The hair on my neck stood up. I reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. Darkness pressed against me. I stayed frozen until dawn, listening as the whispering faded into silence. When I finally left for work the next morning, the driveway was clear. No marks, no carvings, nothing. My friends told me I was imagining things, that I had just had too much coffee, that the night and the isolation had gotten to me. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was all in my mind. But I haven't driven out that way since, and I never will. Because even now, years later, I sometimes catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Shadows where they shouldn't be, shapes in my peripheral vision that vanish when I turn to look. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear a whisper calling my name so faint I can barely catch it. I know that whatever it was, whatever followed me that night, it didn't leave me entirely. It never will. Story the end. It was one of those nights where the air felt too heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. The wind had died down hours ago, leaving the streets in an unsettling silence that made even the smallest sounds, like a car door closing or the creak of a loose sign, echo sharply through the neighborhood. I was driving home from a late shift at a convenience store on the outskirts of town. My route took me down a stretch of road that cut through dense woods, the kind where the trees leaned in so close you could barely see the sky, and even the moonlight seemed afraid to touch the asphalt. I had been working there for almost a year, stocking shelves, handling the occasional drunk customer, and cleaning up after messes that people left behind without a second thought. But that night, something felt different. It wasn't exactly fear at first. It was more like a weight pressing against my chest, subtle and insidious, as if I was being watched without knowing why. I shook it off, telling myself it was the fatigue, that the long hours and caffeine crashes were messing with my perception. The road ahead was narrow, the yellow lines faded, and the woods on either side were pitch black. I kept my headlights on high beam, illuminating the twisted shapes of tree branches that reached across the road. About halfway through, I noticed something on the shoulder. At first, I thought it was a deer. This area was full of them, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, standing completely still, staring directly at me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering. My first instinct was to call the police, but I had no cell service. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I rolled to a stop about 15 feet away. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, dark against the black of the woods. Something about the way it was tilted slightly forward, shoulders hunched, made it look wrong, like it wasn't quite human. I debated whether to keep driving or get out, and somewhere deep down I knew getting out would be a mistake. I slowly rolled the window down just a crack and called, "Hey, are you okay?" The air was heavy and still, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls, just that tense silence. The figure didn't answer. Then, as if on cue, it lifted its head and tilted it in that same unnatural way. My stomach dropped. It was staring, but not at me. Not really. Its gaze seemed to look right through the car, right through the metal and glass, as though it was seeing something else entirely. I slammed the window shut and floored the gas, tires squealing on the cracked asphalt. I didn't look back, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave, lingering in the corners of my mind as the trees thinned and the road eventually led me back to the dim glow of streetlights. I tried to laugh it off once I got home, shaking my head as I fumbled with the keys. I told myself it was a hitchhiker or someone playing a prank, but I couldn't shake the image of that head tilt, so deliberate, so inhuman. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept seeing it in the shadows, in the corners of my bedroom, even when I turned on the lights. I checked all the locks, triple-checked the doors and windows, and even left a lamp on in the living room. The house was quiet, too quiet, and every creak sounded like footsteps. Over the next few days, I noticed little things that didn't make sense. Items in my apartment weren't where I remembered leaving them. My keys would be on the counter when I was certain I left them in my bag. My trash bin was full when I was sure I had taken it out. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion and stress. But then the scratching started. Not loud, like someone was clawing at the walls, but subtle, delicate, just enough that I'd freeze in place and listen, convinced someone was creeping around. I never found anything when I went to investigate. One night, a week after that first sighting, I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A soft, deliberate thump coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. Not loud enough to be someone walking, but the rhythm was too intentional to be random settling of the house. I sat up, heart racing, straining to hear. Then came another, followed by a whisper so faint I thought I imagined it. "Hello?" I froze. My bedroom door was closed, locked even. The whisper didn't sound human. It was almost a sigh, like air moving through a throat that wasn't there. I wanted to run, to grab my phone and leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt paralyzed by some invisible weight pressing on me from the other side of the door. The whispers continued, low and urgent, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to understand, yet somehow felt like a warning. My lamp flickered. Shadows shifted in a way that didn't match the light. I finally scrambled out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, and swung the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, perfectly still. But the feeling didn't go away. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rust and old blood. The next day, I told a coworker about the roadside encounter, expecting skepticism. She didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me. Instead, her face went pale. "You saw it," she said quietly. "I've seen it too." She went on to explain that a few people in town had reported seeing the same figure on that stretch of road over the last few months. Always at night, always standing still, always tilting its head the same way. No one ever stopped it. No one ever approached it. Some said it disappeared when you tried to get close. Some said it followed you home. Most people stopped talking about it after a while, but she claimed she had the same feeling I did, that it wasn't just watching you, it was learning, waiting, marking you in some way. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed in the living room with all the lights on, phone in hand, scanning the darkness outside my windows. Hours passed. Around 2:30 a.m. I heard it. Soft, scraping noises on the outside of my apartment building. Slow, deliberate, circling sounds. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the bat again and tiptoed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek. There, standing by the fire escape, was the figure. Completely still, completely black against the night, with that same impossible tilt of the head. I froze, unable to look away. It raised one hand and slowly waved. My first instinct was disbelief. Why would a creature like that wave? But there was no mistake. The gesture was intentional, mocking almost. I slammed the curtain shut, backed away, and stayed huddled against the wall until the first light of dawn. The next morning, I considered calling the police, but what could I say? Someone, something, with a weird head, was waving at me outside my apartment. I didn't expect them to believe me. I tried to shake it off as a hallucination, a stress-induced nightmare. But deep down I knew better. I started avoiding the stretch of road where I had first seen it, taking longer, inconvenient routes. Still, every time I drove past that area, I felt the weight on my chest again, the impossible awareness that I wasn't alone in the world. Weeks passed. The encounters became more frequent. I would see shadows move just outside my peripheral vision, feel a presence following me in stores, hear whispers in the dead quiet of my apartment. Things would vanish and reappear, small but unnerving. A spoon missing from the drawer, a chair slightly moved, a light turned off. One night, I awoke to the sound of breathing in my bedroom, slow, shallow, and rasping. I grabbed my bat and lunged toward the sound. Nothing, just the empty room, dimly lit by the streetlight filtering through the blinds. But the smell, metallic, rusted like iron, hung thick in the air. One night, I decided to set up a camera. I wanted proof, some tangible evidence of what was happening. I left it pointed at the window facing the fire escape and went to bed, trying to convince myself this was all paranoia. Around 1:47 a.m., the camera caught something that made me rethink every rational thought I had ever had. There, on the balcony outside, the figure was crouched, motionless, staring directly at the lens, its head tilted in that same impossible angle. Then it raised its hand again, not waving this time, but pointing directly at me. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I watched the footage over and over, convinced I had imagined it, but every frame confirmed it was real. Something out there knew I was watching it. After that, the encounters escalated. It began showing up in places it shouldn't be able to. grocery stores, parking lots near the office where I worked. Always distant, always just a shadow at the edge of vision, for I always gone when I tried to focus on it. Once, I saw it in the reflection of a car window as I was driving past. Its face, though featureless, was unmistakable, tilted in that same unnatural way, and it looked directly at me. I swerved, nearly hitting a tree. I began sleeping in my clothes, ready to run at a moment's notice, but no matter how fast or far I went, it always seemed to be there, waiting. One morning, I found a note slipped under my door. Not written, just scratched into a piece of cardboard in some uneven, jagged lines that looked almost like claw marks. It said nothing that I could understand. It wasn't words. It was just a pattern. A message meant for me, I knew instinctively. My skin crawled as I realized it had been inside my apartment while I slept. It wasn't just outside. It had been in my home. I moved after that, packed up everything I owned, left my apartment without looking back, and relocated to a town hundreds of miles away. I changed my phone number, my route to work, my schedule. For a while, it felt like relief, like freedom. But the weight never truly left. A few months later, while walking through a grocery store, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. It was quick, fleeting, and gone before I could react, but the tilt of the head, just for a split second, told me all I needed to know. No matter where you go, no matter how far, some things don't stay behind. I learned that the hard way. Every quiet street, every empty hallway, every time the night is grim and still, I feel it. Watching, waiting, learning. And I know one day I'll see it again. That impossible tilt of the head, the unnatural stillness, the way it watches you, not with eyes, but with intent. And when that day comes, there may be no running, no escaping, no hiding at all. I still drive down that road sometimes, cautiously, hoping I won't see it. And sometimes I do. Always in the distance, always still, always watching. The weight in my chest returns instantly. The air feels heavy again, and I know I am not alone. It is patient. It is eternal. And no matter what I do, it will always find me. Story the end. The night had settled like a heavy blanket over the small town of Willow Creek. It was one of those nights where the wind didn't move the trees, where even the crickets seemed to hold their breath, and the streetlights glowed weakly, barely pushing back the darkness. The town was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a pause, a suspended moment before something unseen crept in. I had driven in from a nearby city, taking the long, winding roads that cut through dense woods to reach the old cabin my friend Mark had rented. I hadn't been out there since college, and I hadn't seen Mark in years. He had insisted it would be good to reconnect, away from the buzz of phones and people. I should have known something felt off when my GPS lost signal halfway through the drive, and I found myself relying solely on the dimly lit road and the occasional reflective road sign. Mark's cabin was exactly as he described it in his texts. Isolated, rustic, sitting at the end of a gravel path flanked by towering pine trees. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and for a moment I thought the sight was comforting. I parked and noticed the quiet immediately. It wasn't the usual country quiet with frogs and insects. It was heavier, more oppressive. I stepped out of my car, and the air smelled damp and earthy like rain had fallen not long ago. I could hear my own footsteps crunching against the gravel, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my stomach tighten. I knocked on the door, half expecting Mark to burst out laughing at some joke. Instead, the door creaked open slowly on its own, revealing the dim interior lit by a single overhead bulb. Mark was nowhere in sight. "Mark?" I called, but my voice sounded swallowed by the house. I stepped in, my shoes leaving wet prints on the wooden floor, and that's when I noticed the smell, a mix of damp wood, something metallic, and faintly burnt hair. My stomach turned. The house felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty, like it had been waiting for someone to walk in. "Mark?" I tried again, moving toward the living room. That's when I saw him, or what looked like him, sitting in a chair at the far end of the room. His back was to me, hunched, and he wasn't moving. I called his name again, and the figure slowly turned. The face that looked at me was familiar and yet horribly distorted. His eyes were too wide, glassy, almost black, and his skin had a pallid gray hue. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and I froze, the word "help" catching in my throat. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he stood up. But something wasn't right. His movements were jerky, too fast, like a poorly tuned film. He stepped toward me, and I realized with sudden horror that the chair was now empty. The figure had disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at my chest. The house seemed to breathe around me, the floorboards groaning under invisible weight, the walls creaking as if stretching. I ran upstairs, thinking Mark might be there, maybe playing a cruel prank, but the hallway at the top was empty. There were photographs on the wall, family photos mostly, but they all showed the same man. Not Mark, but the figure I had just seen. Every photo depicted him in different settings, different years, but his eyes were always the same, black, hollow, staring through the frame. I stepped closer, my hand brushing the surface of a photo, and I swear I felt it move, the figure's lips twitching as if whispering a word I couldn't hear. Then I heard it, a faint tapping from the ceiling. It wasn't rhythmic, just irregular, like fingernails dragging across wood. I froze, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. It moved, circling above me, faster now, closer to the wall. The light flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something peer over the railing. A shadowy face, contorted, smiling. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the wall, and the tapping stopped. Silence fell again, thicker than before, pressing against my ears. I wanted to leave, but my feet refused to move. It was like the house had rooted me there, demanding that I see whatever was happening next. I remembered the basement door. Mark had mentioned storing firewood down there. I hesitated, but something, a compulsion I didn't understand, made me turn the handle. The door creaked open, revealing darkness so complete it felt like swallowing me whole. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and switched it on. The beam cut through the black, illuminating damp walls and stacked wood. But at the far end, something moved. A figure, hunched and twitching, slid into the shadows before I could focus. My breath caught. I called out, my voice shaking. "Mark, is that you?" No answer. Only a low, wet sound, like something dragging along the floor. I stepped cautiously, the beam of the flashlight shaking. That's when I saw it, scratches on the floorboards, deep gouges leading to a wall at the back of the basement. The wall wasn't solid. It looked different, like the wood was thinner, warped, as if hiding something. I reached out, and the moment my fingers touched the surface, the air went cold. A voice, raspy and wet, whispered from behind the wall, "You shouldn't be here." I jerked my hand back and shined the flashlight around. Nothing. Only shadows. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't Mark's idea of a joke. Something was in the house, and it had been waiting. I turned to leave, but the basement door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The flashlight flickered, and I heard the low, wet scratching again, now circling around me. I pressed against the door, screaming, pounding, but it wouldn't budge. Then a cold hand gripped my ankle. I screamed again, kicking and twisting, and managed to break free, scrambling up the stairs. Every step seemed longer, the air thicker. When I finally reached the top, I saw him, or it, standing in the doorway of my room. Not Mark, but the same figure from the photos, the same hollow eyes. It tilted its head, studying me, and I realized it didn't blink. It never would. I grabbed the closest thing, a chair, and swung, connecting with something solid. A wet, crunching sound followed, and the figure jerked back, letting out a sound that was a mixture of human and animal. It hissed, and the lights went out. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door again, and this time it opened. Outside, the night had changed. The wind had picked up, moaning through the trees like lost souls. The gravel under my shoes felt uneven, almost alive, shifting as I ran. I didn't look back, though I could feel the presence following, just beyond the reach of the headlights. The road stretched endlessly, dark and twisting, and I realized my car wasn't where I had left it. Instead, I found an old pickup, rusted and empty, with the keys dangling from the ignition. Desperation overrode logic, and I got in, praying it would start. It did, with a cough and a shudder, and I drove blindly, following the faint glow of distant lights I hoped were part of town. Hours later, I made it back to the main highway. I pulled over to catch my breath, hands trembling on the steering wheel. My phone had no signal, but the faint glow of the screen revealed messages from Mark I hadn't received until that moment. "Don't come out tonight," one read, sent hours ago. "I can't get rid of it. Stay home." Another message, older, said simply, "It watches. Always." I stared at the screen, cold sweat running down my face. I didn't know if Mark had been warning me about some supernatural entity or if he himself had been consumed by it. Either way, the cabin was behind me, and I could still feel it, something in the shadows, moving, waiting, patient. Sleep didn't come that night. I kept imagining the figure's eyes in the dark, its smile stretching impossibly wide. When dawn came, I drove to the nearest town, trying to piece together what I had seen. The locals were friendly enough, but offered little help. When I mentioned Mark's cabin, they exchanged worried glances, muttering about old legends. Old Willow Creek has a history, one said. Cabins out there, people go missing. Some say it's the forest, some say something else. You better keep moving before night falls again. I laughed nervously, but deep down I knew they weren't joking. That night, back in a motel on the edge of town, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the building, every shadow cast by the flickering light, made my stomach tighten. I dreamed of the cabin, of the figure waiting in the corner, and I woke to find scratches on the motel door, fresh and deep. The air smelled damp and metallic, the same as the cabin. I convinced myself it was a nightmare, an echo of fear, but part of me knew it wasn't. The scratches seemed deliberate, measured, like a warning. I tried to contact Mark, calling his number repeatedly. Each time it went straight to voicemail. No response. Days turned into a week, and still nothing. Friends I reached out to in the city said they hadn't heard from him either. I decided I had to return to the cabin, to confront whatever had taken him or at least understand what I had seen. The drive back was nerve-wracking. The roads seemed longer, the trees leaning in closer, whispering. When I reached the gravel path, I nearly drove past, hesitant to see what awaited me. The cabin looked untouched, normal even, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney again. But I knew better. The air was too still, too heavy. I parked and approached cautiously. The door was unlocked. Inside, the place looked ordinary, except for the photos. The wall that had displayed Mark's family photos was empty, stripped bare, as if whatever had lived there didn't want witnesses. Then I heard it, tapping, low and irregular, circling above. My stomach sank. I moved toward the stairs, and the smell hit me first. Burnt hair, metallic, damp wood. The basement door stood ajar. I shined my flashlight inside, and the beam fell on scratches, gouges, and at the far end, a shadow that seemed to breathe. The whisper came again, "You shouldn't be here." My hands shook, but I shone the light higher. The shadow recoiled, revealing a wall warped unnaturally, pulsing slightly as if breathing. I backed away, and the figure emerged, tall now, its limbs too long, its movements jerky, unnatural. The eyes, black, hollow, locked onto mine. It didn't run, didn't chase. It waited. Patient. I realized then that it wasn't about killing. It was about watching, observing, marking its territory. The legend Mark had warned me about, the locals had hinted at, all of it converged into one horrifying truth. This presence was bound to the land, to the forest, to the houses built on it. Once you saw it, it followed. There was no escape. Running only delayed the inevitable. I fled again, faster this time, not looking back until I reached the highway. The night was no longer still. The wind screamed through the trees, branches snapping as if reaching for me. I didn't sleep the next night, nor the night after. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every tree lining the roads whispered in a voice I could almost understand. I never went back to Willow Creek, but I could feel it sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, in reflections, even in dreams. It waits, patient, waiting for the next visitor to wander too deep into the forest, too far from the road, too far from safety. And when it finds you, it won't need to chase. You'll know it is there. You'll see it in the eyes of people you once trusted, in the shadows that move just slightly behind you, in the corners of your own home when the lights flicker. And you'll understand that some places, some presences, are meant to be left alone. The cabin in Willow Creek was one of those places. Mark is gone, taken long before I arrived, and I'll never know exactly what I saw that night. But I know it exists. And if you ever find yourself on a grim and still night alone in the woods, you should remember, the shadows are never empty. The eyes are always watching. Story the end. It was the kind of night where the air hung heavy, almost viscous, and even the usual sounds of the neighborhood seemed muted, as if the world itself had been swallowed by some invisible weight. I had moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of a Midwestern town just a few weeks prior, drawn by the quiet streets and the low rent that fit my tight budget. The house was old, a weathered two-story with a sagging porch and windows that rattled when the wind gusted through the empty fields behind it. At first, the loneliness was welcome. I was coming off a difficult breakup, and the thought of solitude was strangely comforting. But that night, something about the stillness made the walls feel like they were closing in. I had finished a late dinner, just a sandwich and some leftovers from the night before, and had settled into the living room with a book. The light from the lamp was warm but dim, casting long, uneven shadows across the furniture. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves and sending occasional branches scraping against the side of the house. I was just reaching the most gripping part of the novel when I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging against wood, coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms upstairs. At first, I told myself it was the house settling, old boards expanding and contracting. I even laughed nervously, thinking about the absurdity of feeling scared in my own home. But then it came again, clearer this time, accompanied by a soft, almost deliberate thump, like someone had set their hand on the banister and slid it downward. My heart rate jumped. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the drawer by the door and crept toward the staircase. The beam cut through the darkness in a shaky circle, illuminating the patterned carpet and the wooden railing, but nothing else. I called out softly, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the heavy air. No answer. I slowly ascended the stairs, each creak of the wood amplified in the silence. The sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. At the top, the hallway stretched out in front of me, the doors to the bedrooms closed. I shone the flashlight down the hall, checking each door. Everything seemed normal, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the floor in front of the guest room door, there were small, wet footprints leading toward the door. They were too small to be adult-sized, almost like a child had left them there, and they glistened in the beam of the flashlight. I froze. There was no one living in this house but me. I hadn't heard the footsteps from downstairs, yet somehow these footprints had appeared in the span of a few minutes. I considered calling the police, but my phone was downstairs, and the thought of leaving the hallway to get it made my skin crawl. I had to know what I was dealing with. Slowly, I reached down and touched the prints. They were cold and sticky, almost like someone had stepped in water and then walked across the floor. My stomach churned as I realized they led straight to the guest room. I took a deep breath, readying myself, and then turned the doorknob. The room was empty, completely bare, aside from the thin layer of dust on the old dresser and a small bed pushed against the wall. No one was there. I stepped back, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, maybe someone had been playing a prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I locked the door and returned downstairs, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a heavy cloak. The rest of the night passed in a tense, restless blur. I kept the lights on, unable to stop checking the windows and doors. Every small noise made me jump. A branch hitting the window, the hum of the refrigerator, even the ticking of the old wall clock. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I fell into a fitful sleep on the couch, the flashlight clutched in my hand. When I woke, it was early morning, and the sun had barely begun to pierce the gray sky. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that felt natural again. I laughed at myself for being so scared, telling myself it had all been a dream or a figment of my imagination. That illusion of safety lasted until the next night. I had just finished making dinner when I heard it again, scratching, this time from the kitchen. My hands froze over the knife I had been using to cut vegetables. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't coming from outside. I could feel it vibrating through the walls. Slowly, I followed the noise toward the back door, flashlight in hand. When I shone the light toward the kitchen corner, I froze. There, scrawled across the wall in what looked like the same wet substance as the footprints, were words, "I see you." Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair, my flashlight clattering to the floor. I scrambled to pick it up, and the beam caught something that made my stomach drop even further. A small, dark figure crouched in the corner, barely visible but undeniably there. It looked like a child, but its face was obscured, and the way it stayed perfectly still made it seem almost unnatural. I shouted, "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond. My mind raced. I could call the police, I could leave the house, but a part of me was frozen, unable to act. And then, in an instant, the figure darted out of sight, and the words on the wall were gone as if they had never been there. The kitchen was empty, normal. I spent the rest of that night in my car, parked in front of a 24-hour diner, staring at the house from across the street. I couldn't go back inside, not yet, not until I understood what was happening. I didn't sleep. I just watched the house, the windows dark and silent, waiting for some sign of movement. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination or a stress-induced nightmare. I went to the local hardware store and bought extra locks, a security system, and motion sensors for every window and door. That night, I sat in the living room, surrounded by the glow of the monitors, my heart hammering every time a sensor beeped. The first few hours passed without incident. Then, around midnight, the motion sensor in the hallway went off. I jumped, grabbing the flashlight, and saw nothing when I shone it down the hall. But then, slowly, I noticed it. The floorboards had been scratched in a long line, leading from the top of the stairs to the guest room. Not wet this time, just gouged and raw, like claws had torn through the wood. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't dare. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, watching the monitors, every creak of the old house making me flinch. And then, when the sun finally rose, I saw it, written in the condensation on the inside of the front window, letters large and jagged, "You can't leave." That day, I tried to leave. I packed a bag, intending to drive to my friend's house and stay there until I could figure out what was happening. But when I opened the front door, there was a figure standing on the porch. It was tall, thin, and featureless, dressed in dark, tattered clothing that seemed to ripple even though there was no wind. I froze, unable to move as it simply stood there, watching. After what felt like hours, it slowly raised an arm and pointed at me. I didn't need to be told what it meant. I slammed the door, locked it, and stayed inside. For weeks, I refused to leave the house, surviving on takeout and whatever supplies I had. I installed cameras, tried to record what was happening, but whenever I played back the footage, the figure was always just a shadow, fleeting and indistinct. It started appearing in more places, standing at the foot of my bed, peering through windows, sitting silently in the corner of rooms where I'd been alone. Sometimes it moved objects, small things at first, a chair slightly shifted, a picture frame tilted, but then larger things, doors slammed, drawers opened, even the refrigerator door would swing open by itself. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing over me, or crouched at the end of the hallway, waiting. I stopped leaving the living room entirely, barricading myself with furniture and locking every door. But it didn't matter. The figure would appear anyway. Always there, always watching. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of soft, childlike singing. It was coming from the guest room. My flashlight in hand, I approached the door, which was slightly ajar. The singing stopped as soon as I reached it. I pushed the door open fully. Empty. But on the bed, written in the dust, were the words, "Stay with me." I fled to the living room, sat in the corner, and didn't move for hours. The figure didn't appear, not immediately. I thought I might finally have a reprieve. But then, as dawn approached, I saw it reflected in the window, a dark, featureless silhouette standing in the yard, unmoving. I opened the door to confront it, but the yard was empty. After that, things escalated. It started leaving physical marks on me, scratches along my arms, deep enough to bleed, but never enough to call for medical help. Objects flew across rooms when I wasn't looking, and I could hear whispering in the corners of my mind, soft, unintelligible, but insistent. I tried to call for help. Friends, family, even the police, but every time someone entered the house, the figure vanished. Only I could see it. Only I could hear it. The authorities found nothing wrong, chalking up my experiences to stress and isolation. Even my friends began to doubt me, suggesting therapy, medication, anything to explain my terror away. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it was real. Months passed. I stopped trying to leave. I stopped eating regularly. I stayed in the living room, surrounded by the glow of the monitors and the fortifications I had built. The figure was always there now, even in daylight, lurking in the corners of my vision, watching, waiting. It didn't need to move to terrify me anymore. Its presence alone was enough to crush my sense of reality. And then one night, it spoke. Not with words I could understand, but with a cold, deep resonance that filled my chest and made my teeth ache. It said one thing, over and over: "You belong here." I don't leave my house anymore. I don't sleep. I exist in a state of perpetual watchfulness, terrified to blink, terrified to move. Sometimes I hear it whispering behind me. Sometimes I see it in the monitors, staring from places where no human could stand. And I know in the deepest part of me that is waiting for the moment when I finally surrender, when I stop resisting, because it knows I cannot leave. I belong here now. I have started writing this down because I need someone to know, someone to understand that it is real. I am trapped, and I am not alone. Even now, as I write, I can feel its gaze on me from the corner of the room. It does not blink. It does not move. It waits. I don't know how long I will survive this. The hours stretch like days, the nights are endless, and the figure is constant. I am convinced now that anyone who enters this house would become like me, watchful, fearful, broken. The walls themselves seem to thrum with its presence, vibrating with a cold energy that I cannot escape. Sometimes I hear a door creak that I didn't open, footsteps pacing the floor that I can't see, the soft, chilling giggle of a child that does not exist. I have tried to document everything, to leave signs for anyone who might come after me, to warn them, but the house erases it all. The words I write vanish when I look away. The marks I make in the dust disappear. And even my memories of certain events feel hazy, as though the house itself is rewriting reality around me. I do not know how this started or why it has chosen me, but I know one thing. It is patient. It does not rush, it does not tire, it does not forget, and it waits for the moment when I finally realize that there is no escape, that this house is no longer a home, but a prison. A prison where the walls are alive, the air is heavy, and the darkness itself is watching. I hear it now, in the quiet, as I type this. Just beyond the edge of the light, crouched in the corner, still and unmoving, waiting. It knows I am aware of it. It knows I am terrified, and it likes that. If anyone ever finds this, know this. Do not come to this house. Do not step inside. Do not linger on the porch. Do not even glance at it from across the street. There is something here, something that does not belong to this world, something patient, intelligent, and cruel. It will see you. It will watch you. And eventually it will make you stay. I am writing this because it may be the last record of my existence before it claims me entirely. It whispers now, its voice curling around the edges of my mind, "You are mine." I do not sleep. I do not leave the living room. I do not dare turn away. I can feel it breathing somewhere in the house, a slow, deliberate inhalation that matches the thrum of my own heart. And I know deep down that it has always been here, waiting for me to notice it. I don't know how long I will last. I can feel it leaning closer, the cold pressing through the walls, through the air, through me. And I know that eventually I will have no choice but to succumb, because the house is not mine, the night is not mine, and I am not mine. I am trapped, always, and it is patient. Story the end. The night had fallen like a heavy curtain over the small town of Millstone, a quiet place tucked deep in the forests of upstate New York. The kind of town where everyone knew each other, where the streets were nearly empty by 10, and the air carried the cold bite of the early autumn. I was driving home from my late shift at the diner on the edge of town, the one where the neon sign flickered sporadically, painting the asphalt in streaks of red and blue. The road was long, narrow, and mostly abandoned at this hour, winding through dense woods that seemed to swallow the headlights whole. I remember that night because it felt different from any other. There was a stillness to it, a pressure that pressed against my chest as I drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, and every sound, the hum of my tires on the road, the occasional rustle of leaves, felt amplified. Somewhere along the line, I started noticing shapes among the trees, fleeting glimpses that didn't belong. At first, I thought they were deer or stray raccoons, but something about their movement, or the lack of it, didn't feel natural. Halfway through the winding stretch, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might be audible over the car's engine. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, dark and still against the shadows of the trees. At first, I thought maybe it was a hitchhiker, someone stranded and desperate for a ride, but there was something about the way it tilted its head that made me freeze in place. It wasn't a natural tilt. It was as if its head had no hinge, no neck, just bent at an impossible angle. I sat there for a moment, debating what to do. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, to ignore it and get home, but my curiosity anchored me to that spot. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The figure remained perfectly still, almost as if it were studying me rather than waiting for help. I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like the world had momentarily shifted off its axis. I floored the gas and drove past, stealing glances at the edge of the woods, convinced it was following me. But by the time I looked straight in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there, only the empty, twisting road and the heavy darkness of the trees. The encounter haunted me. Sleep became a battlefield. I would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I heard footsteps in my apartment. Shadows seemed to stretch and warp in ways that defied reason. Sometimes I could swear the figure was there, just at the edge of my vision, tilting its head in the same unnatural way. I would jerk my head around to confront it, only to find nothing. Just darkness. Always darkness. I started noticing small things out of place. Items in my apartment would shift positions. A cup I left on the counter would appear on the table. My trash would be full when I was sure I had taken it out. At first, I blamed exhaustion, stress, maybe even hallucinations, but the unease never left. One night, a scratching sound began outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate, almost like someone or something was tracing the walls with its fingers. I held my breath, frozen until the sound stopped. When I finally dared to check, nothing was there. But the air smelled metallic, like iron and rust, and I felt an almost suffocating presence pressing down. Over the next week, the figure appeared in more places, sometimes at the edge of the woods near my apartment complex, other times glimpsed outside windows when I wasn't looking directly at it. Always still, always tilting its head. Once, while driving home from the diner, I saw it standing on the side of the road again. This time, it raised a hand, not waving, not beckoning, just pointing straight at me. My stomach dropped, and I swerved into the shoulder, nearly hitting a tree. I couldn't explain it. I tried to rationalize, tell myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but the terror in my chest was undeniable. I spoke to a coworker about it, expecting ridicule. Instead, her face went pale. She told me she had seen it too, months earlier in the same stretch of road. Other townspeople had reported sightings as well, always at night, always fleeting, always disturbing. Some claimed the figure vanished when approached. Some said it seemed to follow you home. I began realizing this was no ordinary stranger, no prank. This was something else entirely, something that existed outside the normal rules of the world. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of heavy breathing in my bedroom. My door was closed and locked. My first instinct was to flee, but my body refused to move. The breathing continued, slow, deliberate, and rasping, coming from the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. I grabbed a baseball bat and lunged toward the sound. Nothing. The shadows remained still, but the metallic smell lingered, stronger than ever. I set up a camera to catch it, hoping for proof. That night, I pointed it toward the fire escape outside my window. Around 1:47 a.m., the camera caught it. The figure crouched on the balcony, staring directly into the lens. Its head tilted impossibly, its presence suffocating. Then it raised its hand, not waving, but pointing at me. I could barely breathe as I watched the footage, the realization sinking in that it had been observing me, studying me, perhaps for months. The encounters escalated. It began appearing in public places, grocery stores, parking lots, even outside the diner during my shift. Always fleeting, always at the edge of vision, always gone when I turned to face it. Once, in a reflection of a car window, I saw its face, or the lack thereof, tilt toward me, featureless yet unmistakable. I began living in a constant state of hyper-awareness, sleeping in clothes ready to flee, checking windows and doors obsessively. Then came the note. A piece of cardboard slipped under my door, jagged scratches forming a pattern, not words. Something that meant something only to it, a message I instinctively understood. It had been inside my apartment while I slept. My home was not safe. I moved, packed everything, left Millstone behind, changed my number, my routines, my route to work. For months, I felt safe, far removed from that stretch of road and its shadowed woods. And then, in the grocery store one evening, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. Just a second, gone before I could react. But that head tilt, impossible and unnatural, told me all I needed to know. It had found me again. No matter where I go, no matter how far, the figure is always near, always waiting. Every quiet street, every empty hallway, every grim and still night carries its weight. And I know, in my bones, that the day I see it fully again is coming. I can't hide forever. It is patient, eternal, and relentless. And when it finally arrives, there may be no escape. Story the end. It had been a week since I moved into the small rental house on the outskirts of town. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a quiet place to work on my writing. The house was old, built sometime in the late 50s with peeling paint on the exterior and a yard that hadn't been touched in years. I figured the dilapidated look would be fine. It was cheap, and I had a feeling I could fix it up slowly. The real estate agent assured me it was cozy, but I didn't care much about appearances. I needed solitude. What I didn't realize was how deep that solitude would cut. The first few nights were typical of settling into a new home. Strange creaks from the floorboards, the wind rattling the windows, the occasional scurry of rodents in the walls. I ignored it all. It felt like part of the charm. On the fourth night, I was working late in the living room when I heard it. A soft thump upstairs, like someone walking on the floor above me. The house only had one story, but there was a small attic space accessible through a hatch in the ceiling. I hadn't even been up there yet. Thinking it might be a raccoon or some other small animal, I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up. The attic was dusty, filled with forgotten boxes and old furniture. Nothing moved, and nothing made a sound. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back down. That night, sleep was restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I could hear faint whispers, just beyond the edge of hearing. The kind of sound you notice only when everything else is quiet. I told myself it was stress from moving, or maybe the wind again. A couple of days later, the whispers became voices. Not clear, but words that seemed to shift and curl in the shadows. One night, I was in the kitchen making coffee around 3 in the morning. The house was completely silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I froze when I heard my name, just my first name, murmured from the hallway behind me. The voice was soft, almost too faint to make out, but unmistakably calling me. I spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty, dark, stretching toward the back of the house where the bedrooms were. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands shaking, and checked every room. Nothing. No signs of a break-in, no shadows, no one there. I tried to convince myself it was the combination of exhaustion and nerves. The next day, I noticed something strange in the yard. While taking out the trash, I saw footprints in the morning dew that led up to the side door and stopped there. I live alone. I have no pets. I double-checked the locks. All doors and windows were still latched. I felt a chill, the first real one since I moved in. I took a picture of the prints with my phone, but when I looked at it later, they were blurred in the photo, almost smudged, like the camera couldn't capture them clearly. It was Thursday night when the real fear began. I had been working on a story in the living room, headphones in, completely absorbed. Around 11:30, I took them off because I thought I heard something, a soft scratching sound coming from the back of the house. The living room looked normal. The kitchen, too. But as I approached the hallway leading to the bedrooms, the scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging across the wooden floor. I froze, listening. Then it stopped. Silence. And then, clear as day, a whisper right behind me said, "I see you." I spun around, empty hallway. My heart pounding, I backed into the living room and slammed the front door shut, locking it. I stayed up the rest of the night in the living room with all the lights on. I didn't sleep at all. That morning, I found a smear of dirt along the hallway floor, leading from the kitchen toward the bedrooms. It wasn't much, maybe the size of a hand, but it had been dragged across the floor. I considered calling someone, police, friends, anyone, but I didn't want them to think I was crazy. I also didn't want anyone else in the house. I was starting to feel trapped. The next few nights escalated quickly. Doors that I had locked in the evening were found unlocked in the morning. Drawers I knew I had closed were left slightly ajar. Objects moved, my keys, my phone, my wallet, everything. I started taking pictures every day, setting up my phone in different parts of the house to catch movement. The photos showed nothing. Blank hallways, empty rooms, shadows that didn't make sense. But the feeling that I wasn't alone never left. On Sunday, it rained heavily. The wind slammed against the house and the gutters rattled. I was in the living room when I heard something crash upstairs, like a chair being thrown. The attic. I couldn't ignore it. My first instinct was to run, but curiosity, or maybe denial, pulled me toward the hatch. I climbed up, knife in hand. The attic was the same, dusty and filled with boxes. But as I moved to leave, I saw it. On the far wall, scratched into the plaster, were words. I couldn't understand them at first, but they were crude, almost childlike. I am here. I am watching. Below it, another line. Do not sleep. I dropped my knife. My hands shook. I snapped a photo and ran downstairs. I locked myself in the living room with my laptop, trying to rationalize. This was insane. This was my mind playing tricks. Maybe the previous tenant had been someone disturbed leaving messages behind. But the words looked fresh, wet in the scratches. I could still smell something faint, metallic, like iron. Sleep became impossible. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of shadow kept me awake. I started sleeping in the living room, under a blanket, with lights on, listening. The voices came more often, now almost every hour. They didn't speak in words so much as they hissed, breathed, laughed softly. Sometimes they sounded like multiple voices circling the room. Once I heard the front door creak open. I didn't move. I didn't want to see. Then footsteps slowly padded across the floor toward me, slow, deliberate, careful. And then they stopped, right outside the living room. My front door, locked, my only exit. I held my breath. I couldn't see anything. Nothing came. And then silence. Hours passed. When dawn broke, I was exhausted, trembling. The following week, I noticed another pattern. The disturbances happened at night, always when the wind was low, when the house felt still. But during the day, the house was quiet. Nothing moved, no whispers, no shadows, almost as if the entity, or whatever it was, respected the daylight. I tried calling friends, telling them what was happening. They were sympathetic, but skeptical. Maybe you're stressed, one said. New house, new environment, give it time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't stress. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone or something always in the dark corners of the house, waiting. One night, about 2 weeks after I moved in, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering directly in my ear. I bolted upright in bed. The room was empty, the window was closed. But on the floor by the bed, I saw a figure crouched, just at the edge of the shadows, dark, featureless, hunched. It didn't move, it didn't speak. It just stared. I froze. The air felt heavy, thick, like I was breathing through water. Then it shifted, just a fraction, and then it vanished. I ran out of the bedroom into the living room and didn't sleep the rest of the night. I started sleeping fully clothed, knife under my pillow, phone in hand, lights on. I didn't want to close my eyes. A week later, I came home from a grocery run and noticed something impossible. On my porch, there was a small, handmade doll. It looked like a child had made it, roughly stitched together with fabric scraps, but its face was smeared with what looked like dirt, or worse. I didn't recognize the doll. I didn't have pets. I didn't know neighbors well. I picked it up. It was warm like it had been recently handled. I threw it in the trash, locked the doors, and checked every room. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. But that night, the whispers were louder than ever. They taunted me, almost playfully. We see you. Sleep is forbidden. Why do you hide? Over the next month, I tried everything. I burned sage. I left lights on. I called priests. I even tried recording the voices. Nothing worked. The shadows deepened at night. Figures appeared fleetingly just in the corners of my eyes. Doors opened on their own, and the attic hatch seemed to pulse, like it had a heartbeat. I stopped leaving the house at night. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped trusting the daylight. It became a game of endurance, one that I was losing. Then, one night, the entity escalated. I was sitting in the living room, laptop open, trying to work. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged the air. The lights flickered. Then came the smell, iron and rot, overwhelming. And then footsteps, not slow this time, Fast, scurrying, circling the room. I couldn't tell how many. They ran past me up the stairs to the attic, back down, and then silence. I exhaled. Tried to convince myself it was my mind. But when I looked at the floor, I saw fresh scratches leading from the living room to the hallway and words scrawled in the dust. Tonight, you will sleep with us. I didn't sleep. I didn't blink. I didn't move from the couch until sunrise, staring at the hallway, counting every sound. When daylight came, the house seemed calm again, almost normal. I tried to leave for a bit, to get coffee, to clear my head. But when I stepped outside, I saw the footprints again, larger this time. Not human. They trailed around the house, stopped abruptly at the edge of the woods behind the property. I took a photo and sent it to a friend, but when they saw it, they said, "Looks fake, like someone drew it." I started noticing things in mirrors, reflections that didn't match my movements, shadows behind me, but no one there. My phone started glitching. Texts I hadn't sent appeared, photos I hadn't taken. One night, I woke to my own voice whispering from the hallway, "Come to us." I froze. It sounded exactly like me. I never left the living room. It wasn't my voice, not really. And that was the moment I realized the house didn't want me to leave. It didn't want me to exist in normal time. It wanted me inside, under its gaze, always. The realization was sickening, suffocating. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper was a tether, pulling me further into a darkness that wasn't just physical, but mental. I could feel it, see it, smell it, in every corner, every room, every flicker of the lights. Weeks turned into months. I stopped counting nights. Sleep became a memory or a concept from another life. Food, water, and sanity became secondary concerns. The house grew louder, more persistent. The whispers became shouts. The shadows gained shapes, faces. At times I could swear I felt hands brush my arms, tug at my clothing, press against my skin in the dark. I screamed once, and the house answered, not with silence, but with laughter. Not playful, but cruel, deliberate. I realized I was inside something alive, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me long before I arrived. I tried leaving once, packed a bag, ran to my car, engine started, but the house wasn't done with me. As I backed out, I swore I saw a figure in the rearview mirror, standing where my bedroom had been. It waved, slowly, deliberately, smiling. I couldn't move. I slammed the car in reverse, screeching, and almost hit a tree. The figure was gone. I never tried leaving again. The thought of stepping outside, even for a minute, filled me with a primal terror I cannot describe. It's not fear of harm. It's fear of attention, of acknowledgement, of what waits when the threshold is crossed. Now, months have passed. I exist in this house in a state between wakefulness and nightmare. I write in fits, never finishing, never leaving notes for anyone. I eat, I drink, I maintain a semblance of life. The attic hatch is always closed. The doll sits in the corner of the living room, watching. The whispers continue. Sometimes they mimic my neighbors, my coworkers' voices from my past. Sometimes they are something else entirely, something older, something hungry. I've stopped trying to understand. The only truth I know is this: the house is patient, and it is always watching, always listening, always waiting. The nights are grim, still, heavy with a quiet that presses on the chest and clings to the skin. Shadows stretch and move when I'm not looking. I do not sleep. I do not leave. I do not speak. And yet I am here, aware, conscious, trapped within walls that are alive, aware, sentient. I hear every creak, every whisper, every crawl of darkness. I have learned to move silently, to not startle, to not tempt attention. But it is always there, waiting, knowing, watching. And so I write these words not as a confession, but as a record. If someone finds this, knows this, understands, take this warning. Houses are not always empty, and sometimes the quietest, stillest places hold the loudest truths. The words scratched into the attic, the footsteps in the dead of night, the doll in the corner, these are not warnings. They are invitations. And I cannot leave. Story the end. It was the kind of night that made the world feel suspended, like time had slowed to a crawl, and the air itself was holding its breath. The wind outside whispered faintly through the pines, carrying the damp scent of the forest after a long, light rain. In the small town of Millersville, the streets were empty, lit only by the weak glow of street lamps, their lights struggling to cut through the thick darkness that seemed to press against every window. Most people were indoors, doors locked, lights on, trying to convince themselves that the night wasn't alive with something watching. But not everyone. I had just moved into an older rental house on the outskirts of town. It was cheap, the kind of place a college student or someone trying to start over might pick without much thought. It had wood floors that creaked and old floral wallpaper that peeled slightly in the corners, giving the place an almost lived-in character that, though it had sat empty for months before I arrived. I had been warned about the drafts, the uneven floorboards, and the groaning of the heating system in winter, but I hadn't been warned about the nights, the long, grim, still nights. The first night I spent there, I tried to ignore the silence. I had a small lamp in the living room, and I spent most of my time sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, listening to music at a low volume. Occasionally, I would hear the faint thump of something in the walls, likely just the house settling, I told myself. But when I went to bed that night, I realized how completely silent it was outside. The usual hum of distant traffic, the occasional dog barking, none of it existed here. It was only the wind sighing through the trees and the occasional thump that made the floorboards protest under their own weight. About an hour after I fell asleep, I woke to a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I lay there, trying to convince myself it was rain hitting the window, though I knew the rain had stopped hours ago. And the tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the front door. My heart started to beat faster. The door had a chain lock, and the deadbolt was fully engaged. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the side of the house. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the rest of that night awake, eyes wide open, listening to the occasional noises, taps, creaks, whispers of movement that didn't belong to the wind. By morning, I was exhausted, but relieved that nothing had happened. I chalked it up to nerves. Days passed and life went on. I got used to the quiet. I got used to the house's quirks. The way the lights sometimes flickered, the way the floors groaned, the way the doors never seemed to sit flush with their frames. Then, one evening, about a week after I moved in, I started noticing small things. The kind of things that don't make sense until you can't unsee them. It began with objects being out of place. A mug in the kitchen was on the counter, and when I returned a few minutes later, it was on the floor. A book I had left on the living room table appeared on the bed. At first, I thought I was misremembering, absent-mindedly moving things around. But then the noises started again. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, in the hallway outside my bedroom. I would freeze, straining to hear, and then the house would go silent, as if nothing had ever moved. One night I woke to the sound of breathing. Not my own, not something from the heating vent, but heavy, deliberate breathing coming from just outside my bedroom door. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. It was long, drawn out, and when it stopped, I could hear the soft scrape of something across the wooden floor. I reached for my phone, and when I turned on the flashlight, the hallway was empty. Nothing moved, nothing seemed wrong, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I started sleeping with the bedroom door locked, but it didn't help. The noises grew more distinct, almost purposeful. I would hear whispers, faint and indistinct, words that sounded like they could have been my name. Sometimes, I would hear a soft laughter that would stop the moment I focused on it. I began to avoid the living room at night, staying in my bedroom with the door locked and the lights on. It was a Thursday night, rainy and dark, when it escalated. I had been working late at the diner and arrived home past midnight. The rain was heavy, drumming against the roof and windows. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt that familiar tension, the sense that I was not alone. I flicked on the light and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. That's when I saw it. The mug I always kept by the sink was on the floor, broken into pieces. I hadn't touched it that day. I cleaned it up quickly, heart racing, and decided to call it a night. I locked my bedroom door, set the alarm, and tried to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of scratching, soft at first, then louder, as if something were clawing at the wood. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as the scratching moved closer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. Then came the whispering, low, cold, almost dripping with malice. "Why are you here?" it hissed. My stomach turned to ice. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The operator answered, and I whispered the situation, barely able to get the words out. They said a patrol would be sent immediately. I stayed on the line, flashlight in hand, staring at the door. The scratching continued, slower now, deliberate, like whatever it was waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers, the scratching, even the sound of the rain seemed muted. Minutes later, the police arrived. I opened the door, relieved, and they swept through the house. Outside, in the rain, the streets were empty, the air silent except for the patrol car's engine. Inside, there was nothing. No one. No evidence of forced entry, no signs of intrusion. They asked if I had any mental health issues, drugs, alcohol, anything that might explain hallucinations. I shook my head, exhausted and shaking. They told me to stay elsewhere for the night. I went to a friend's house, trying to convince myself it had all been stress, an overactive imagination fueled by a dark house and a quiet night. I stayed at my friend's for a few nights, but the pull of the house was strong. I returned, telling myself I needed to reclaim my space, to not give in to fear. The first night back, I heard a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. I didn't answer. It stopped. Later, in the bedroom, I found the book I had been reading placed on the floor, open to a random page. Things escalated quickly after that. The house became alive with sounds that made no sense. Footsteps pacing in the hallway, doors opening and closing when I was in the room, whispers in languages I couldn't understand, and always the feeling of being watched. I began installing cameras, thinking I would catch someone, anyone moving in the house. When I reviewed the footage, nothing appeared. The rooms were empty, the doors still, no movement at all. Yet I knew what I had heard. I had felt it. One night, I woke to the sound of someone breathing directly next to my bed. I froze, straining to see through the darkness. Then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder, heavy, pressing down, not trying to harm me, but not friendly either. My heart raced, and I bolted upright, turning on the light. The room was empty, the bed untouched except for the indentation I had just felt. I began leaving the lights on constantly, never staying in one room for too long, eating meals quickly, always keeping my back to a wall. I started hearing things in my sleep, whispers, footsteps, soft breathing, the creak of floorboards that weren't mine. One morning, I woke to find every drawer in the kitchen open, every cabinet rattled, food on the floor. I lived alone. Then, one night, it reached its peak. I was sitting in the living room, a blanket over my lap, trying to watch TV to distract myself. The screen flickered, then went black. I checked the breaker. Nothing had tripped. A soft tapping started on the window. I ignored it at first, thinking it was rain. Then came the whisper, clear, deliberate, coming from the corner of the room. "You shouldn't be here." I turned, heart hammering. Nothing. The tapping continued, now joined by a soft scratching along the walls. I picked up a knife from the kitchen, shaking, and backed into the corner. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone pacing just behind me, moving from room to room, stopping when I froze, resuming when I looked away. I ran to the front door, unlocked it, and ran outside into the rain. My neighbors were asleep. No lights flickered in any of the houses. I called my parents and told them I couldn't stay there anymore. They insisted I come home, but I had to leave the house immediately. As I drove away, I turned back once. In the front window, I swear I saw a shadow, tall and thin, standing there, watching me leave. Its head tilted slowly, deliberately, as if studying me. I never went back. The house still sits on the outskirts of Millersville, dark and quiet most days, but people tell me that on grim, still nights you can hear tapping, whispering, soft footsteps pacing the floors. The police never found any evidence of intrusion, no signs of forced entry, nothing. The house is empty, yet I know what I experienced was real. Years later, I still have trouble being alone at night. Silence unnerves me. The wind feels too loud. Shadows feel too deep. Sometimes I dream of that house, of the whispers, the cold hand, the shadow at the window. I wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, certain that something is just beyond the door, watching, waiting. I have told the story to a few close friends, some dismissing it as paranoia, others refusing to ask questions for fear of the answer. I know the truth. There was something there, something patient and deliberate, something that wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I want to. The memory of that night, the sound of that breathing, the cold weight of a hand on my shoulder, I carry it with me always, and sometimes on grim and still nights, I think I can feel it again, just beyond the reach of the light, waiting. Story the end. It was the kind of night where the wind barely moved, the streetlights flickered weakly, and the world seemed suspended between reality and something else entirely. The small town of Fairview had been quiet all day, the kind of quiet that settled into your bones. I had just finished a late shift at the diner on Main Street, the one I'd worked at for 3 years. I was tired, hungry, and ready to crawl into bed, but the diner had been running behind schedule, and I ended up staying until closing. The parking lot was empty except for my old pickup, and the neon sign buzzed faintly as I slid in behind the wheel. I had lived in Fairview my whole life, so I was used to the eerie quiet that seemed to dominate nights like this. But that night felt different, heavier somehow, like the silence was waiting. I started the truck and drove slowly down Main Street, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The occasional flicker of the neon signs from closed stores lit the cracked sidewalks in harsh blue and red. I passed the old hardware store that had been shuttered for years, and I thought I saw someone standing just inside the dusty windows. My stomach tightened. I squinted, but there was nothing there when I blinked. It was probably just my imagination. I told myself that as I drove on, the tires crunching against the loose gravel on the side roads. I lived alone in a small, two-story house on the outskirts of town. The route from Main Street to my house was about 20 minutes, winding through a stretch of woods that had always made me uneasy. My parents had warned me when I was younger not to walk those woods alone at night, but now I drove through them almost every day without a second thought. The trees cast long, sharp shadows in my headlights, their branches like twisted fingers reaching toward the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but I brushed it off. Just nerves, I thought. Just nerves. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was pitch dark. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of the old house hitting me immediately. Dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic. I hung up my coat, poured myself a glass of water, and sank into the couch, exhausted. The quiet pressed in, heavier than usual. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but the channels were all static. Even the radio wouldn't turn on. I leaned back, feeling a gnawing unease in my chest, and wondered if the power had gone out in the whole neighborhood. Then I heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from upstairs. My pulse spiked. I live alone. There shouldn't be anyone up there. The sound was soft, deliberate, like nails dragging along the wood floor. I froze, straining to listen. It stopped. My heart was hammering, but I told myself it was just the old house settling. Old houses made noises. That's all it was. I told myself this again and again as I climbed the stairs to check the bedrooms. The hall was dark, the wood cold beneath my bare feet. I reached the top and slowly walked down the hallway, stopping at each door. All were closed and empty. I was about to turn back when I noticed the attic door. It's a small, hinged door at the end of the hall, one I rarely used. Tonight, it was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it that morning. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been up there in months. I should just leave it. Maybe it had shifted on its own. But some part of me, a foolish, stubborn part, pushed me forward. I reached out and pulled it open. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture covered in yellowing sheets. My eyes adjusted slowly. At first, there was nothing. Then I saw it. A figure crouched in the far corner, its back to me. I froze, paralyzed. The scratching started again, low and deliberate, coming from the corner where the figure crouched. I don't remember moving, but the next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the figure. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. I leaned closer, squinting, and then it turned. It wasn't a person, not exactly. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to stretch into the darkness behind it. Its mouth opened slightly, a soundless gape that sent a chill down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then it spoke, though not with words. The sound was like a low, gurgling hiss that seemed to echo inside my skull. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair, and the figure darted toward me with a speed I didn't think possible. I screamed and ran down the attic stairs, slamming the door behind me. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock as my hands shook uncontrollably. When I finally stepped outside, the night was still. No one was there. The woods were silent. My truck sat where I had left it, untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away, my headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the diner again. I didn't care about the keys in the truck, the house, or anything else. I just needed to be somewhere familiar. When I got there, the doors were locked, of course, but the interior lights were on. I pressed my face to the glass and saw the entire diner empty, chairs upturned, floors swept. Nothing out of the ordinary, except the booth in the corner. There was someone sitting there, hunched over, facing away from me. I opened the door slowly, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called. The figure didn't respond. I stepped closer, and the chair squeaked as if someone had just moved slightly. When I got close enough, I saw the back of its head. It had no hair, pale skin stretched tightly over its skull, and then it turned. Not fully, just a tilt of the head, enough for me to see the eyes, hollow, black pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. I ran, out the back door, into the alley, and all the way to my truck. I didn't look back. I drove until the roads became familiar, until the darkness seemed less heavy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Not by a car, not by a person, but by that same oppressive presence, lingering just at the edge of my awareness. When I finally reached home hours later, the neighborhood was still quiet. Too quiet. I left the truck running in the driveway and approached the house cautiously. Everything seemed normal. The front door was still locked, the windows dark. I went inside, trying to calm my racing heart. I checked every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. No sign of anyone. And yet, I could feel it, the awareness, the watching. I slept that night on the couch, fully dressed, the TV and radio still dead, the silence pressing in on all sides. And then I started hearing it again. Not footsteps this time, not scratching, but whispers. Low, almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to make sense of them, to find a source, but the words were garbled, like some language I couldn't understand. I covered my ears, but the murmurs didn't stop. They were inside my head now, repeating, circling. Morning came, gray and overcast, but brought no relief. The whispers faded, but the house still felt wrong. I noticed things were moved, objects not where I remembered them, small details like a book turned upside down or a chair slightly out of place. Nothing violent, nothing overt, just subtle disturbances that made the house feel alive. Days passed. I didn't leave the house except for necessities. I didn't call anyone. Friends would have thought I was overreacting, but I knew. I could feel it. At night, the whispers returned, louder now, accompanied by shadows that moved just outside my peripheral vision. I started locking all doors and windows, but it didn't help. They didn't need the doors. The figure had shown me that. I started noticing other things too. Marks on the walls, scratches that weren't there before, small handprints in dust on furniture I had just cleaned. Objects would disappear and reappear in different locations. My reflection in the mirror sometimes didn't match me exactly. A flicker of something else in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong to any physical object. One night I was awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a voice clearly for the first time. Not a whisper, not a hiss, but a voice. Slow, deliberate, soft but unmistakable. "You can't leave." I bolted upright, heart hammering, and the room was empty. But the voice had come from inside my own head. From that moment on, I realized it didn't just want to scare me. It wanted me trapped. The presence followed me everywhere. In the house, in my dreams, even in the small trips I took into town. It was patient, waiting for moments when I was alone, creeping into the spaces I thought were private. I tried everything. I left the house for weeks, staying in motels, in friends' houses, driving far away during the day. But it followed, always there, lurking just at the edge of perception. I started to lose track of time, the nights blending into each other. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Crouched, pale, hollow-eyed, waiting. Eventually, I stopped leaving. I barricaded myself inside my house, but it didn't matter. The whispers didn't stop. The shadows didn't stop. And sometimes late at night, I hear it moving in the hall, crouching in the corners, always watching. I know it will never leave, and I know it will never stop. And now, even writing this, I feel it watching me, waiting for me to look away, to let my guard down. The last thing I can say is this. If you hear scratching at night in an empty house, if you see shadows that move on their own, if you feel like something is watching you even when you're alone, believe it, because it's real. And once it chooses you, it never lets go. Story the end. It had been one of those nights that felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The streets of the small Midwestern town were deserted, the usual hum of distant traffic replaced by an unsettling stillness. A low fog had settled over the town, curling around street lamps and muffling sound, turning ordinary houses into shadowed silhouettes. The kind of night that makes the shadows feel too thick, the darkness a little too close. Alex Morgan had just finished a late shift at the diner he worked at downtown. The place had been empty for hours, the regulars gone, the neon sign outside flickering in the foggy night. He'd been looking forward to getting home, collapsing into his worn recliner and losing himself in the mindless distraction of TV. The night had already been long, and the drive home was usually 15 minutes at most. But tonight, it felt longer, like the fog had seeped into the very streets themselves. His car was an old Honda Civic, reliable but aging, and the headlights cut weakly through the haze. As he drove down Main Street, the fog seemed to press against the windshield, thickening by the second, distorting familiar landmarks into something uncanny. Street lamps were just dim glows in the gray void. Somewhere off to the side, the sound of a dog barking echoed faintly, then stopped abruptly, as if swallowed by the night. Alex tightened his grip on the wheel, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He told himself he was being ridiculous. He'd lived in this town all his life. He knew these streets. Yet something about the fog tonight was different. It wasn't just the obscured vision, it was the silence, the way every small sound seemed amplified and then cut off too quickly. Turning onto Elm Street, Alex noticed a figure standing near the corner of the gas station. At first, he thought it was just a person waiting for a ride, but the way the figure stood, motionless, unnervingly still, made him slow down. The man, or maybe it was a woman, wore a long coat, face hidden in shadows, completely still as Alex passed. His headlights didn't seem to reach the face, and for a moment he could have sworn the figure's head was turned in his direction. But when he blinked, it was gone. He shook his head and tried to focus on the drive. Elm Street was lined with trees, skeletal in the fog, branches reaching out like twisted fingers. He passed a row of houses, most of them dark, curtains drawn, yet the feeling of being watched grew heavier with each passing second. Halfway down the street, Alex's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, relief washing over him when he saw it was just a text from his friend Marcus. "You still up?" He typed back quickly, "Just leaving the diner." "What's up?" The reply came almost immediately. "Nothing. Just don't freak out if you see anything weird tonight." Alex frowned. "Weird how?" he typed, but Marcus didn't reply again. A chill ran down Alex's spine. The text sounded like one of those half-jokes that were actually warnings. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following him, but the fog swallowed everything behind him. As he neared the edge of town, where houses thinned out and the road stretched into open fields, the headlights picked up a figure in the middle of the road ahead, a man standing perfectly still, facing him. Alex slammed on the brakes, heart racing, and skidded to a stop a few feet away. The figure didn't move. He could make out the shape of a hooded jacket, a glimmer of something reflective in the fog. "Hey, what the hell?" Alex shouted, stepping out of the car. His voice sounded small in the dense silence. No response. The figure remained unmoving, unnervingly so, like a mannequin planted in the road. He inched closer, trying to get a better look. And then, as he approached, the figure seemed to vanish, just like that. No shadow, no retreating footsteps, nothing. The fog had swallowed it entirely. Alex's chest heaved. "Jesus, what the hell is going on tonight?" he muttered. He went back to the car, locked the doors, and tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the fog, maybe someone playing a prank. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered before roaring to life. As he drove past where the figure had been, he noticed tire tracks in the wet asphalt, but they led to nowhere, fading into the fog, as if someone had been standing in the middle of the road without a vehicle. He tried to shake it off and speed up, eager to reach the safety of his apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The drive normally took 10 minutes, but tonight, Every turn seemed to stretch time. Every shadow seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision. By the time he reached the entrance to the apartment complex, he was sweating despite the chill. He parked, leaving the headlights on, and grabbed his keys, forcing himself to walk quickly to the front door. As he inserted the key, he thought he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate. He spun around. Empty. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Get a grip, Alex." Inside his apartment, he tried to calm down. The place was quiet, dimly lit by a single lamp. He dropped his bag on the couch and went to the kitchen for water. The apartment was exactly as he'd left it. No signs of intrusion, no misplaced items. Just an ordinary, ordinary night. But the unease lingered, gnawing at him. Sitting on the couch, he scrolled through his phone. No missed calls, no notifications beyond Marcus's cryptic text. He considered calling him, but hesitated. Something about the way Marcus had worded the message made him feel wrong, like a warning too late to heed. Around midnight, the power flickered. Just a quick, almost imperceptible blackout, then the lights returned. Alex froze, listening. The apartment was silent, but then he heard it. A tapping sound at the window, soft, deliberate, irregular. He froze, staring at the window across the living room. The curtains were closed, but the tapping continued, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. His pulse quickened. He approached slowly, trying to tell himself it was just a branch, the fog swirling outside, causing a branch to hit the window. But as he drew closer, he noticed something that made him stumble back. A handprint, smudged on the outside of the glass. Large and wet. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure he'd imagined it. He reached for his phone to call the police. But then remembered it was barely moving through the fog out there, and calling wouldn't do anything in the middle of the night. He backed away, unsure of what to do. That's when he heard it. Another sound, soft at first, like breathing, low and deliberate. Then, unmistakably, a whisper. "Alex! Alex!" His blood ran cold. He spun toward the sound. Nothing, just the dim apartment, his furniture, his shadows. He reached for the kitchen knife, hands trembling. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if it were right behind him. He whipped around, empty. The room felt suddenly claustrophobic, the air thick. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows. And then, from the corner of the room, a movement, a shadow that didn't belong to any piece of furniture, shifting against the far wall. Alex screamed and lunged for the door, throwing it open and bolting down the hallway. The sound followed him, a faint shuffle just behind him, always keeping pace, but never fully revealing itself. He reached the stairs, 2 at a time, his apartment above the ground floor, and ran into the lobby. Empty. The front door, normally unlocked for residents, was closed and silent. He fumbled with the lock, adrenaline making his hands shake. Finally, it gave, and he ran into the fog outside, gasping for air. The streets were silent again, empty, like the town itself had vanished. As he reached the car, he caught a glimpse of a figure standing under a street lamp across the lot. Same hooded jacket, same stillness, just watching. Alex jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove off. The figure didn't move. It didn't vanish. It didn't follow. It just stood there, waiting. Alex didn't stop driving until he reached the highway, the fog thinning slightly as he moved farther from town. His mind raced, trying to rationalize. Sleep deprivation, overwork, stress. The mind played tricks at night. But the image of the figure and the whispers in his apartment were too real, too deliberate. By the time he reached his sister's house a few towns over, he was shaking. He told her everything, every detail, every moment of the night. She listened quietly, face pale, and when he finished, she said something he wasn't expecting. "Alex, that sounds like the Hollow Man." He stared at her. "The what?" "It's an old story from around here. Foggy nights, lone drivers, whispers. People see him, hear their names, sometimes in their own apartments, sometimes on the road. He doesn't follow, not really. But people who see him, they say it sticks. The fear. The feeling that something's just behind you always. You remember the fear, and it doesn't leave." Alex laughed nervously. "You're kidding, right?" "That's just a story." "Do you want me to tell you the story?" she asked, voice low, serious. He hesitated. "I guess." "Yeah." She described it in hushed tones, a story of a figure that appeared on foggy nights, often in small towns, standing silently in streets or appearing in homes. People said the figure never spoke, but if it whispered, It was your name, your fears, your secrets, and once it appeared to you as exclaimed, the memory of that fear would linger, creeping into your dreams, changing your sense of reality. Alex shivered. That night, he couldn't sleep at his sister's. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hooded figure standing under the street lamp in the fog, waiting. He could still hear the whispers, faint, impossible to place. He drove home the next day in broad daylight, the streets empty but fully visible, yet every shadow, every alley seemed familiar now, too familiar, like he'd seen it before. Weeks passed, but the fear lingered. He avoided the fog, the streets at night. The diner at night, once a mundane routine, became a place he avoided, fearing the drive home. His friends noticed a change, but he couldn't explain it. Then came the dreams. At first, subtle. A fog-filled street, a figure standing still, a whisper of his name. Gradually, they grew more vivid, figures standing at the end of hallways, watching him sleep, shadows in corners that weren't there during the day. The fear wasn't just in the night, it seeped into his waking hours, the feeling of being followed, watched, studied. One night, he woke to the sound of tapping again. Not on a window this time, but on his bedroom door. The fog from that night still haunted him in memory, but the sound was real, echoing in the quiet of his house. He froze, breath caught, heart racing. Alex, the whisper came again, low and deliberate. The fear was no longer just a memory. It had returned, relentless. And he realized in that moment that some things didn't stay in stories. Some things waited in the fog, in the stillness, watching and whispering your name when the world was quiet enough to hear it. He never saw the figure again in person, but he didn't need to. The fear had taken root, permanent, creeping in into every shadow, every dark corner, every moment of stillness. Some nights, even in broad daylight, he could feel it, like a weight on the back of his neck, a cold presence, the memory of that whisper. Alex, Alex. The small Midwestern town seemed ordinary to everyone else. To Alex, it was a place haunted by silence, by fog, by a presence that could be anywhere and nowhere at once. He moved eventually, but no matter where he went, the memory of that night never left. He carried the weight of the Hollow Man's visit forever. The terror of being watched, whispered to, remembered in fear, long after the streets had cleared and the fog had lifted. Even now, years later, when the night falls grim and still, Alex finds himself scanning the shadows, listening for a whisper that shouldn't exist, and knowing that somewhere out there, the figure waits. Story, the end. It was the kind of night where the wind seemed to pause before it even touched the trees, and the stars were muted behind a heavy gray sky. I remember thinking, as I drove down the empty backroads of northern Maine, that the world felt still, not peaceful. Still, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I had been visiting my aunt in Portland, staying with her after a long week of work in Boston. The city had been loud and exhausting, and I was eager for the solitude that only a long drive through the woods could offer. That sense of relief, though, quickly faded when I turned off the main highway onto a narrow dirt road that wound deep into the forest. I was alone, my little sedan the only vehicle for miles. The headlights cut a narrow path through the fog that had begun rolling in. Thick tendrils of mist curled across the road, making the trees on either side look like twisted, reaching shadows. I tried to shake the unease that had started coiling in my stomach. I told myself it was just the late hour, the isolation, nothing more. But deep down, I felt like I shouldn't be here, like I had taken a wrong turn somewhere and the universe was quietly letting me know. After about 20 minutes of driving, the fog became almost tangible, like I could reach out and touch it. That's when I saw the first figure. At first, I thought it was a deer. Its eyes caught the light and glowed briefly before vanishing behind a clump of brush. But then it moved, walking upright, and that's when my heart began to hammer against my ribs. There was a man, or at least something that looked human, standing on the side of the road. He was thin, unnaturally so, and wore a long coat that hung loosely from his shoulders. His face was obscured, shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I slowed the car, unsure if I should stop. My rational mind told me to keep driving, but some primal part of me wanted to see him, to know what he was doing out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour. As I passed, he turned his head slightly, and I could swear he was staring straight at me. Not looking, staring. The kind of look that makes you feel like your thoughts are laid bare, like someone can see into your soul. I felt the hair on my arms rise. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, my little sedan bouncing over the uneven road. The figure remained on the side of the road, motionless, watching me disappear into the fog. I told myself I had imagined it, that it had been a trick of the light, but my chest was still tight with fear. Another 10 minutes down the road, and the fog seemed to thicken, pressing against my windshield like a living thing. Then I heard it, a soft tapping against the roof of the car. My hands went white on the steering wheel. I told myself it was branches brushing against the car, but the sound continued, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. The road behind me was empty, swallowed by the gray mist. My pulse was racing, and I could feel my skin prickling as if I had suddenly grown eyes all over my body. I took a deep breath, telling myself to stay calm. "It's just a tree branch," I whispered aloud. But then I saw the second figure. This one was standing directly in the middle of the road, blocking me. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the wet dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared. I could see the outline of a man, but the proportions were off. His limbs were too long, his head too small, and the coat he wore seemed to shift subtly, like it wasn't quite anchored to a physical body. I couldn't see a face. There was just darkness where it should have been. My instinct was to reverse, to get back onto the main highway, but the fog behind me made that impossible. It felt like the road had disappeared, leaving only this nightmarish path forward. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, and I realized it was smiling, or at least it seemed to be. A cold dread settled into my chest. I forced my foot off the brake and slowly drove forward, keeping my eyes on the edges of the figure, but not directly at it. As I passed, I could hear a whispering, soft and almost melodic, like a voice carried by the wind. "Don't leave," it said. "Stay." I slammed the accelerator, my car bouncing over the ruts in the road. When I looked back in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it had run into the woods, but I knew deep down that it hadn't. Something about the air had changed. The stillness felt wrong. I finally reached a small clearing where the road split. One path led deeper into the forest, narrower and darker. The other wound back toward the faint glow of distant highway lights. I chose the highway path, my hands shaking. The fog slowly thinned, and I started to feel some relief, but it was short-lived. That's when I noticed the scratches. On my rear windshield, faint but unmistakable, there were long, vertical scratches, not from a tree. They were too precise, too deliberate. My stomach dropped. I had the distinct sense that whatever had been in the road with me hadn't wanted me to leave, that it had followed. I reached the highway and pulled over at the next gas station, my hands still trembling. The attendant gave me a cursory glance and went back to wiping the counter. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But the scratches were still there, and they seemed to glint under the fluorescent lights, almost like they were wet. I took a picture with my phone, and when I zoomed in, I could swear I saw a shadowy figure reflected in the glass, its head tilted the same way as the one in the road. I drove home in silence, never taking my eyes off the road, never stopping again that night. A few nights later, I tried to tell my aunt about it. I knew she'd laugh it off, but I needed to say it out loud. She listened quietly, her brow furrowed. Then she told me something I hadn't known. Decades ago, there had been stories in this region about a figure known locally as the Watcher. It wasn't human, and it didn't age. It would appear on quiet, foggy nights, always watching, always following. People who encountered it either disappeared or went mad. She shrugged it off, calling it an old wives' tale, but I could see the unease in her eyes. She didn't have to believe it for me to know that what I had seen was real. I went back to Boston a week later, telling myself it was just a fluke, just a strange experience born from isolation and fatigue. But then the dreams started. At first, they were subtle. Shadows at the edge of my vision, faint whispers I couldn't place, the feeling of being watched even in my apartment. Then they became vivid. I would dream of driving down endless dirt roads, fog so thick I couldn't see my hands, and always at some point there would be that figure. Always watching, always smiling. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and for a few moments, the world would feel normal until I realized the whispers sometimes lingered just under the threshold of hearing. I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye in my apartment, shadows shifting where there should be none. My friends joked about stress, about overwork, about my vivid imagination, but I knew better. The final straw came one night when I was sitting alone in my living room, scrolling through my phone. The power went out. I wasn't surprised. It happened occasionally in my neighborhood. I got up to grab a flashlight, but before I could, I felt it. The room changed. The shadows stretched unnaturally. The air grew thick, almost tactile. Then I heard it clearly, whispering my name from the corner of the room where no light reached. I froze. My instincts screamed to run, to leave the apartment immediately, but something held me there. I forced myself to breathe, to rationalize. It was the wind, a loose vent, anything. But then the shadow moved. Not a trick of light, an actual shape, stretching from the corner toward me. A figure with limbs too long, a head too small, and a smile that wasn't human. It tilted its head the same way as on the road. My knees went weak. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow hovered inches from me, and I swear I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on my chest. Then the lights flickered back on. The shape vanished. My apartment looked normal, but I knew it hadn't left. I could still feel it there, lingering at the edges of perception. I left that night. I packed a bag and went to my aunt's place, and I've been trying to avoid that stretch of northern Maine ever since. But the whispers sometimes follow me, soft and insistent, like an echo of that night. And when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I swear I can see a figure in the distance, watching, waiting, smiling in a way that no human ever should. I know now that some things don't belong to this world, that the stillness of a quiet night is often the first warning, and that when you feel eyes on you in the dead of night, it's not paranoia, it's survival. The Watcher isn't a story to scare children. It's a truth. A presence that slips between the spaces of our reality, waiting for the perfect moment to remind you that you are never, ever alone. Even now, years later, I avoid back roads, forests, and nights with heavy fog. Sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear the faintest tap on the window, or a whisper too soft to recognize. And in those moments, I can almost see it. A thin figure with an impossibly small head, watching from the edge of the shadows, smiling that unnatural, patient smile. The fear never fully leaves, not when you've seen something that doesn't belong here, not when you've been chosen or noticed, not when it knows where you are. I still drive at night, but only on well-lit highways, never through the thick woods. I check my mirrors constantly, and sometimes, just sometimes, I feel that familiar chill when the air shifts, when the night grows heavy and the world falls silent. That's when I know it's near. Watching, waiting, patient, always patient. And I wonder if I'll ever be free of it, or if some nights, in some quiet corner of the world, I'll find myself back on that foggy road, and the figure will be there again, smiling as though no time has passed at all. There are nights I can't sleep, nights when the wind is too still and the shadows linger too long, nights when I imagine that thin figure walking silently at the edge of my street, tilting its head, whispering softly, promising that it hasn't forgotten. I know I'll never see it in daylight. The sun, I imagine, keeps it hidden like a wound that only becomes visible under the cloak of night. But night comes, every day. And every night the possibility remains that it's there, waiting, watching, patient beyond comprehension, reminding me that no matter how far I run or how carefully I avoid the woods, the fog, the back roads, it could find me again. And I know one day it will. Story. The end. It was one of those nights where the wind barely stirred the trees, and the silence seemed almost tangible, pressing against the windows and seeping into every corner of the small town of Millfield, Ohio. I had moved there only a few months prior, escaping the chaos of Chicago, hoping that a quieter place might settle the unease I had carried for years. I had taken a job at a local hardware store, a modest little shop that smelled perpetually of sawdust, motor oil, and old pine, and I had rented a small single-story house on the outskirts of town. The street was narrow, lined with aging maples and oaks, many with limbs that bent and creaked as if straining against the sky. Streetlights were sparse, and their dull yellow glow barely pushed back the shadows that pooled along the asphalt. I remember that night clearly because it began with something so ordinary it hardly registered at first. I had gotten home late from work, the kind of late where the store's dim fluorescent lights feel fluorescent even in your own head. I had tossed my keys onto the counter, flicked on the kitchen light, and set down my bag. The house was silent, a quiet that wasn't unusual, but tonight it felt heavier, like the air itself was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, just a long day, maybe too many cups of coffee, but my skin prickled in that way that makes you turn over your shoulder when there's no one behind you. I made myself a cup of tea, the kind that steeps too long and smells faintly bitter, and settled into the living room chair, trying to ignore the fact that the shadows seemed to gather unnaturally in the corners of the room. I had my laptop open, scrolling through news articles, but my mind kept wandering to the sounds outside. Subtle ones, like a footstep on gravel, the scrape of a branch against a window pane, but every time I checked, nothing was there. I remember muttering to myself, "It's the wind, just the wind." It wasn't long after that when I heard it. The tapping, soft, deliberate, coming from the kitchen window. I froze, my hand clutching the mug like a lifeline. My house had no neighbors within sight, the nearest one a good 2 blocks away, and the night was still. I strained my ears, and there it was again, tap, 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 slow, rhythmic, unnervingly human. I set the mug down and walked cautiously toward the window. I could see nothing but the dark outline of the yard, the faint silhouette of trees swaying ever so slightly in the absence of wind. I told myself I was imagining it, a trick of nerves, maybe a branch knocking. But the sound persisted, a tap, 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 and then, suddenly, a pause. Silence. And then, as if in response to my fear, I heard it from the other side of the house, a faint, dragging shuffle along the back porch. I stepped back, heart thudding against my ribs. The only explanation was someone was out there. Burglars sometimes targeted homes in Millfield, though it was rare. But even that didn't make sense. I had locked the doors, I always did. I had checked, I had triple-checked. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, trying to keep my voice calm, telling the dispatcher there was someone outside. They assured me a patrol would be on the way, but it would take a few minutes. "Stay inside, lock your doors," the voice said, and I nodded even though they couldn't see me. I moved toward the back door, keeping low, heart hammering, only to see that the porch was empty. The swing I had hung there gently rocked, as if someone had just sat down and left. My instincts told me to leave, to drive to the police station or a friend's house, but my car was parked in the driveway, exposed. The rational side of me tried to convince me it was nothing, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I retreated to the living room, locking the door behind me, and tried to distract myself with the laptop. That's when I noticed something on the screensaver. A faint outline of a face pressed against the glass of my living room window. I jumped up, heart leaping into my throat, only to find the window clear. Nothing. The street was empty. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, checking the perimeter. No footprints, no disturbances in the gravel or grass, nothing. Yet the feeling of eyes on me persisted, a weight that didn't belong to the night. I decided to call a friend, someone I trusted, someone who could tell me I wasn't losing it. My friend Matt answered groggily, and I could barely get the words out. "Matt, someone's outside. I don't know what to do." He laughed nervously at first, telling me maybe it was a raccoon or some animal, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice fade when I described the taps, the dragging noise, the swing. Okay, just lock yourself in and wait for the cops," he said, finally sounding concerned. I hung up and sat in the darkness, phone in hand, listening. And that's when the scratching started, coming from the walls themselves, a slow, deliberate scratching like nails dragged across plaster. It moved around the room from one side to the other, circling me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. Every rational explanation, rats, branches, old house settling, faded beneath the raw terror that something else was there. Something watching. The phone rang, and my blood ran cold. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered. "Hello?" I whispered. Silence. Then a soft, raspy voice. "You shouldn't be alone tonight." My hand froze on the phone, my grip tightening. Who is this?" My voice shook. The line clicked dead. The police arrived shortly after, but by the time I reached the front door, the house seemed calm, normal even. The porch swing was still, the yard empty, the windows unbroken. They didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. One officer told me sometimes calls are made by pranksters or by neighbors trying to scare someone, but I knew it wasn't that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. I thought I heard whispers in the kitchen, the faint scent of cigarette smoke, though I had never smoked in the house, never had anyone over. And then at 3 a.m, I heard it. The soft creak of the front door. My front door, locked and bolted, slowly swinging open as if coaxed by invisible hands. I called 911 again, this time barely able to speak. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me while I retreated to my bedroom, locking myself in. I could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the house, stopping just outside my door. I could hear breathing, heavy, deliberate, unnervingly calm. When the officers arrived minutes later, the house was empty again. No footprints, no signs of entry. But they noticed the lock on the front door had been turned. I hadn't touched it. I didn't sleep in that house again. I stayed with friends for weeks, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a mix of exhaustion and stress. But even then, I would catch glimpses of a shadow in the corner of my vision, a figure standing just outside a window. I would hear taps, scratches, and whispers when no one was there. Months later, I returned to pack up the rest of my belongings. The house felt different in the daylight, ordinary. I told myself it was safe, that the shadows I had imagined were gone in the bright light. But as I carried the last box to my car, I saw it, a figure standing in the upstairs window of my own house, tall, thin, featureless, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I never went back. I sold the house to a young couple, telling them nothing about the nights I spent there. They moved in, excited about the quiet street and the charm of the old trees. I drove away, hoping the darkness stayed behind me. A year later, I passed through Millfield and saw the same house, lights flickering inside, though it was the middle of the day. And I remembered the tapping at the window, the dragging on the porch, the whispers in the walls. I realized then that whatever had been in that house wasn't confined by fear or presence. It was patient. It waits, it watches. It moves through the quiet spaces between heartbeats and shadowed corners. And some nights, when the wind is still and the world outside is silent, I can still hear the faint tap, tap, tap of that relentless, patient presence, marking its territory just beyond the veil of the ordinary, reminding me that there are things that watch, things that wait, and things that follow you home when you're alone. I've moved twice since then, far from Millfield, seeking normalcy. I tell myself the episodes were isolated, the paranoia of an overstressed mind. But I never stay alone at night. I leave lights on, doors locked, and I never ever look out my windows when the world is still. Because I know it's watching, always watching. And when the night is grim and silent, you can hear it too. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and there it is again. The feeling that someone is in the room, standing just out of sight. You can feel it in the air, a weight on your chest, a brush of cold that doesn't belong to the weather. I've never been able to see it directly, but I know it's there, always there. And I know that one day, maybe it won't just be the feeling. Maybe one day it will be too close to ignore. Even now, I'm careful not to be alone, careful not to look out the windows after dark, careful to keep my doors locked because it's patient, it waits. And I can still hear the faintest tap, 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 like a warning from a place you can't see, a presence you can't touch, a reminder that sometimes the stillness of a grim night is not empty. Not at all. Story the end. The night was still, almost oppressively so, and the streets of Cedar Hollow seemed to shrink under the weight of an unusual silence. Normally, the soft hum of traffic or the occasional bark of a dog would fill the late hours, but tonight, it felt as though the town itself were holding its breath. I was driving home from my late shift at the diner, the neon lights fading behind me in the rearview mirror, and the road ahead stretched empty, swallowed by the dark trees lining either side. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of rain that had passed hours before, leaving slick asphalt that reflected the pale moonlight. I had moved to Cedar Hollow about 3 months earlier. The town wasn't remarkable in any particular way, just another sleepy place tucked between hills and forests in the Midwest, but it had been cheap, and I needed a fresh start. I didn't know anyone here, and that suited me perfectly. Nights like these, though, made me question whether perfectly was exactly the word I wanted. The diner had been unusually slow tonight, and I'd left earlier than usual, hoping to avoid a long, lonely drive home. But as I drove, I couldn't shake a sense of being watched. My headlights swept over the trees, and I kept expecting to see someone, anything, just standing there, watching me pass. I rationalized it. It had to be my imagination. I'd been stressed, working double shifts, barely sleeping. Still, there was that nagging feeling, an itch in the back of my mind. I noticed movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. My pulse quickened, though I told myself again it was nothing. I'd seen a raccoon before, or maybe just a trick of the shadows. The road curved sharply, and I slowed, gripping the wheel a little tighter. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely discernible in the moonlight, standing at the edge of the woods on the right. It was too still to be an animal. It looked like a person, but I couldn't make out details. My headlights washed over it for a split second, and then it was gone. I slammed on the brakes. My heart was thundering in my chest. No way someone could have disappeared that fast. I scanned the woods frantically. Nothing. I took a deep breath and started driving again, slower this time, my eyes darting to every shadow. 5 minutes later, I reached the old bridge at the edge of town. It wasn't much, a narrow two-lane concrete bridge over a shallow creek, but it had a reputation. People in town talked about it in hushed tones, the kind of stories you hear in passing but never truly pay attention to. They said that sometimes on nights like this, you could see someone standing on the bridge looking down into the water, but they always disappeared before anyone could approach. I didn't believe in that sort of thing. I didn't want to. But as I drove onto the bridge, I saw a figure leaning against the railing, staring down into the creek. I froze. My headlights illuminated the silhouette, tall, thin, completely still. I couldn't see its face. I wanted to call out to ask if it was okay, but my throat had gone dry. My hands were clammy on the wheel. Then, as I passed, it turned toward me. Not in a slow, natural movement, more like it snapped its head toward me, the motion impossibly fast. I caught the glint of something in the darkness, something reflective, eyes, maybe, or a watch. I can't be sure. I jerked the wheel and accelerated, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure the figure could hear it. I didn't stop until I reached the small apartment I was renting near the center of town. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me and sat on the couch, trying to calm down. I told myself it was nothing. My imagination. Stress. Maybe someone was playing a prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen on that bridge hadn't been human. Something about the movement, the way it turned, it didn't make sense. The next day, I tried to distract myself with work. I served pancakes and coffee, smiled at the few regulars who came in, and laughed a little at their stories. But the image of that figure haunted me. That night, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that the darkness had played tricks on me. I fell asleep finally, exhausted, only to wake in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching at my window. I froze. It was a soft, persistent scratching, like claws on glass. My apartment was on the second floor, overlooking a quiet street. No one could be outside. I crept toward the window and peeked through the blinds. Nothing. Just the empty street, slick with rain under the pale light of a street lamp. I returned to bed, heart racing, and tried to will myself to sleep. But then I heard it again, this time from the balcony door. I didn't have a balcony, only a fire escape that was locked from the outside. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice barely above a whisper. The operator tried to reassure me, but when I described the sounds, they told me someone would come by in the morning. They didn't understand. I couldn't wait until morning. The scratching continued, sometimes moving, sometimes still, always there. I couldn't look, I couldn't breathe properly. Eventually exhausted and terrified, I curled up on the couch, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet outside that wasn't quiet at all. The next few nights were worse. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, even though I lived alone. I'd hear whispering, incoherent, just at the edge of hearing. Objects would shift slightly. My keys would be on the counter, then on the floor. I started keeping a knife next to my bed. I didn't know what I was afraid of exactly, but the fear was visceral. One night, about a week later, I woke to the sound of my front door creaking. I froze. The apartment was locked, bolted. Whoever or whatever was out there had a way in. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Footsteps on the floor, slow and deliberate, circling the living room. My phone was in my hand, ready to call 911, but I couldn't breathe. The air seemed heavier, thicker, pressing down on me. Then a voice, soft, low, right at the door. I see you. I didn't move. My entire body trembled. I felt it, not heard, something staring at me from the other side of that door. The whisper came again, closer this time on the other side of the wood. I see you. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Eventually, the sound faded and I collapsed on the couch, shaking, crying silently. The police came in the morning, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry. Nothing out of place except for my own frayed nerves. I started avoiding the windows, covering the mirrors, trying to make my apartment feel less exposed. But the feeling didn't go away. Every night, the same sensation of being watched followed. About a month after the first sighting on the bridge, I had to drive to the grocery store late at night. The roads were empty, the town still, and I tried to keep my mind on mundane things: milk, bread, eggs. But as I turned onto the familiar stretch that led to the bridge, I saw it again. The figure, standing exactly where I'd seen it before. Only this time, it didn't turn away when I approached. It just watched, unmoving, a dark silhouette against the trees. I felt my stomach drop. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to drive away, but I also wanted to see it, to know if it was real. Then it moved, not toward me, but across the road. Not walking, not running, gliding, almost, silently. My headlights followed it, revealing a thin, impossibly tall form. It had no face, just an empty, featureless head tilting slightly as if examining me. I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing, and didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my apartment. I locked every door, every window, and refused to leave for the next 3 days. The nights were unbearable. I didn't sleep. I could hear it moving outside my apartment, sometimes scratching, sometimes whispering, sometimes just watching. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything: names, times, sounds, feelings, but it was no use. The presence never left. One evening, around midnight, I heard a knock at my door. Not a normal knock, but slow, deliberate, like someone was testing patience. I didn't answer. I stayed as still as I could. Another knock, then a voice, low, guttural, almost a growl. Open the door. I didn't. I couldn't. I grabbed the knife beside me and waited. The knocking stopped. Silence, then a scratching sound at the window. I didn't dare look. Days passed like that, nights worse than the last. I started seeing it in my peripheral vision. Glimpses in mirrors, shadows that didn't belong. I tried to leave town, but every road I took seemed to bring me back here. It was as if the town itself had trapped me, or it had. A week later, I made a decision. I had to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight, my knife, and my phone, and I drove to the bridge. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the wheel. When I arrived, the figure was there, waiting, taller than the trees now, I swear. I shined my flashlight on it. Nothing. Just an outline, darker than the night itself. I took a step forward. It tilted its head. I felt a cold wind, unnatural, pressing against me. And then it spoke. Not a voice, not words exactly. Something in my mind, a command, a whisper that wasn't really whisper. You can't leave. I stumbled back, fear paralyzing me. I ran to my car, floored the accelerator, and drove. No matter where I went, I could feel it, trailing me, weighty patient. I don't know if anyone in Cedar Hollow has ever left truly unobserved. I know I haven't. And I know that on nights like tonight, grim, still, heavy with quiet, it's out there, watching, waiting. I write this now from my apartment, too afraid to sleep. Every shadow, every sound reminds me of it. Some people might call it a hallucination, paranoia. Maybe it is, but I know the truth, and so do you if you're reading this late at night alone and hear something moving outside that shouldn't be there. It's patient, it's waiting, and it always finds you. Story the end. The first time I realized something was off about the old house on Elm Street, it wasn't the way the boards in the porch squeaked under my step, or the way the wind seemed to whistle through the cracks in the windows, or even the paint peeling in thick curls from the siding. It was something else. Something that clung to the air, like the smell of rain on dry dirt, that taste of iron on your tongue you never know is there until it's too late. I was 15 and dumb enough to think that the stories about the house being haunted were just that, stories. My friends in the neighborhood whispered about the house when they thought no one older could hear. They said the previous owners had disappeared without a trace, that sometimes you could see shadows moving behind the curtains even though the house had been empty for years. I didn't believe them, not really, until that one night in October when the air had grown so cold it made the hairs on the back of my neck stick up. It started when I was walking home from the bus stop. My route took me past Elm Street, and I usually avoided it because of the house, but that evening the wind had knocked a branch down, forcing me to step closer to the yard than I wanted. The moon was thin, a sharp sliver in the sky, barely enough light to see where I was going. That's when I first saw it, or rather her. She was standing by the broken gate, almost blending into the shadows, but there was something about the way she moved that made my stomach drop. She didn't walk like a normal person. Her steps were deliberate, slow, as if the ground itself feared her weight. She turned her head slowly toward me, and for a second I thought she was a mannequin someone had set up as a prank. Her skin was pale in a way that made the moonlight look warm on her, almost sickly, and her eyes were too dark, too wide. I froze, and she smiled. A small, almost imperceptible curl of her lips that somehow felt like a warning rather than a greeting. I don't remember moving at first. My feet were glued to the sidewalk. She started to walk toward me, and then I remember thinking, I should run, and somehow I managed to tear my gaze away and sprint past the house. The crunch of dead leaves under my feet sounded deafening, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the streetlights. When I glanced back, she was gone, like she had never been there at all. The next day at school, I tried to tell my friends what I had seen, but they laughed it off, saying I was just imagining things. But the thing is, I wasn't imagining. I knew it. And that night, I had trouble sleeping. I could hear the wind rustling outside my window, and every now and then, the faintest creak, like a step on wooden floorboards that weren't mine. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see the house in the daylight, to prove to myself that it was just an abandoned, creepy old structure. I waited until the sun was dipping low, turning the sky the color of bruises, and I slipped out of my house, my backpack swinging against my side. As I approached, the house looked different in the dim light. It seemed to breathe, the shadows curling in the corners like smoke. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly with the wind, inviting me in. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and then I remembered the stories, the disappearance of the last family, the neighbors who swore they heard children crying in the night. And yet I couldn't resist. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't name, something that made my throat tighten. I stepped inside, my shoes silent against the thin layer of dust covering the floorboards. The house was a labyrinth. Every room was the same, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, a lingering sense of eyes watching. I found the living room, and in the corner a small rocking chair moved gently, as if someone had just left it. I knew no one could be there, not really. I called out, my voice cracking. "Hello?" The only reply was the sound of the wind rattling the broken windows. I moved to the staircase. Each step groaned under my weight, echoing through the empty house. At the top, I found the hallway lined with doors. One of them was slightly open, light spilling out even though no lamp burned inside. I pushed it open, and the room was empty, save for a mirror against the far wall. I stepped closer, drawn to my own reflection, but something in the glass made me stop. Behind me, a shape moved. I spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, I wasn't alone. She was there, standing behind me. Her eyes met mine, wide and dark, and her mouth opened in a smile that was all teeth, too many teeth, and then she whispered something, so soft I couldn't hear it at first. Then it became clear. Go! The words slithered through my mind like smoke, filling every corner of my skull. I ran. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, and didn't stop until the house was a shadow behind me. The next few days, I avoided Elm Street. I told my parents I had a lot of homework. I told my friends I was busy. I told anyone who would listen anything to stay away. But at night, when the wind howled against my window, I could hear the soft creak of that rocking chair. Sometimes when the moon was thin, I thought I could see her outside my window, standing at the edge of the yard, just watching. It escalated the following week. I came home from school, walking the long way around so I wouldn't pass the house, and when I unlocked my front door, there was a note taped to it. My name was scrawled across it in uneven dark letters. I unfolded it, my hands shaking. I saw you in the house. I'm still waiting. I slammed the note down on the counter. My parents weren't home yet, and I considered burning it, ripping it up, anything to erase it. But I couldn't. There was something about the handwriting that made my stomach turn. It wasn't neat or messy. It was alive. It moved when I looked at it, curling and stretching slightly, as if breathing. That night I barely slept. Every shadow seemed alive. Every gust of wind felt like a hand brushing against my cheek. I kept the lights on, my phone in my hand, ready to call 911 at the first sign of danger. Around midnight, I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the porch. My heart stopped. I didn't move. The steps continued, slow, deliberate, circling the house. Then silence. Then a soft tapping at my window. I couldn't bring myself to look. My throat was tight, my chest aching. The tapping stopped, and a whisper brushed my ear. You shouldn't have looked. I bolted upright the next morning, drenched in sweat. I told my parents it was just a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. Night after night, the visits continued. Sometimes she would just appear at the edge of my bed, silent, watching. Other times, objects in my room would shift slightly, like someone had leaned against them. I started sleeping in my clothes, keeping the door locked, leaving a light on. It didn't matter. She always found a way. Months passed, and the fear became a part of my life. My friends drifted away, tired of me canceling plans, tired of the fear I couldn't explain. I stopped leaving the house except for school. My parents were concerned but thought it was just teenage anxiety. I knew better. One night during a storm, the power went out. I lit a candle and tried to calm myself, but the flickering light cast long, twisting shadows across the room. That's when I saw her, not at the window, not at the door, but in the corner, perfectly still. My breath caught. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. She tilted her head slowly, like she was studying me. Then she whispered again, "You can't hide." The storm raged on, and I realized something terrifying. It wasn't the house, it wasn't even the street. She had followed me. She had always been with me, waiting, watching, biding her time. And I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that she wouldn't stop until she had me. Days turned into weeks, and I could feel her presence constantly. At school, I would catch glimpses of her reflection in windows, in mirrors, in the screens of my phone. At home, doors would creak open, objects would move, faint whispers curling around my ears. I became paranoid, obsessive, barely sleeping. I tried everything, new apartments, different cities. Nothing helped. She was everywhere I went, a constant shadow at the edge of my vision, always waiting, always smiling that horrible, impossible smile. One night, desperate, I returned to Elm Street. The house was empty, silent, but when I stepped onto the porch, I felt it. The same weight, the same cold, the same watching. I called her name, shaking, my voice echoing in the empty street. No response. But when I looked into the windows, I saw her, sitting in the rocking chair, perfectly still, her eyes locked onto mine. Then she leaned forward and I saw it. The room was filled with reflections, hundreds of them, each one a version of me, trapped, screaming silently. I ran. I ran without stopping through streets I didn't recognize until I collapsed in an alley, shaking and sobbing. And that's when I realized, no matter where I go, no matter how far, she will always be there. Always watching, always waiting. The last time I saw her, I was walking down a quiet street in a town I had never been to before. The sky was grim and still like that first night on Elm Street, and there she was across the road, standing perfectly still, her eyes locked on mine. She smiled, slowly, deliberately, and I knew there was nothing I could do. I'm writing this now because I have nowhere else to go. I don't sleep much, and when I do, I dream of her. And when I wake, I can still feel her there, watching, waiting, smiling. If you ever see an abandoned house with peeling paint and a gate that won't stay closed, don't go near it. Don't look in the windows. And whatever you do, don't ever think you can outrun it. Because it doesn't matter how far you run. It doesn't matter how many towns you cross, how many streets you hide in. Some things don't let go. Some things never sleep, and she is one of them. Story the end.